Hey there! Yes, you tucked in somewhere quiet right now. I am glad you found your way back here tonight. If you're new to this little corner of the internet, welcome. Come sit for a while. Tonight, we're stepping into a room most history books forgot to open. Picture Paris sometime in the middle of the 1700s. Inside a plain-looking house, a dozen of the most brilliant men in Europe are gathered around a dinner table. And not one of them is allowed to raise his voice, insult a rival, or even whisper the king's name. One woman controls the entire room. She cannot vote. She cannot inherit the way her brothers could. She never finished a proper education. And still for nearly 30 years, some of the sharpest minds of the Enlightenment did not dare cross her. Before we step through her front door together, if this is the kind of company you enjoy at this hour, a quiet like on your way in helps this story find its way to more nights just like yours. And if you're new, staying a while and subscribing means you won't miss where the rest of this journey leads. I would love to know something too. Where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. Along with anything this story stirs up in you. I do read through them, even the short ones. Now, if you can dim the lights around you, let a fan hum softly somewhere nearby. Get as comfortable as you're going to get. And let's go inside. Because tonight is not about kings or wars or the names that fill the front covers of history books. Tonight is about the women who sat quietly at the centre of it all, and what actually happened in the rooms they controlled once the door closed behind you. Here is that room now, grey stone walls on the outside, tall windows catching the last grey light of a Paris afternoon. Nothing about the front of the house on the Rue Saint-Honoré would tell a stranger walking past that anything unusual happens here. But step inside on the right afternoon and the air changes almost immediately. There's the smell of melted wax and warm chocolate being poured into small porcelain cups. There's the soft rustle of silk moving across a wooden floor, the scrape of chairs being arranged just so by servants who know without being told exactly who sits where, and who must never be seated across from whom. Somewhere outside, carriage wheels are still arriving over the stones, and already, before a single word of philosophy has been spoken, the evening has been carefully and visibly designed. Even the order in which guests are shown into the room has been decided in advance. Because in a world this obsessed with rank and reputation, being seated a moment too late or a chair too far from the centre could feel like a small quiet insult that took weeks to forgive. The woman who owns this house is not seated at the head of the table. She rarely is. You will find her near the middle, in a plain grey dress that could belong to a merchant's wife rather than the most sought-after hostess in France. Hands folded, eyes moving slowly from guest to guest like she is counting something only she can see. Her name is Marie-Thérèse Geoffrin, and by the time our story catches up with her, she has spent nearly 2 decades turning ordinary Wednesday afternoons into something all of Europe cannot stop talking about. She was not born into any of this. Her mother died before she could remember her face. Her father worked as a servant in a noble household, which meant Marie-Thérèse grew up on the edges of wealth without ever truly belonging to it. What education she received came almost by accident, sitting quietly in the corner of an older woman's gatherings as a teenager, absorbing conversation she was never formally invited to join. At just 14 years old, she was married off to a man nearly 3 times her age. It was by every account a practical arrangement and not romantic one, which in that century was simply how most marriages worked, for women with very little say in the matter. And yet somewhere between that quiet corner seat and this candlelit dining room, something remarkable happened. The girl nobody thought to educate became the woman nobody dared to interrupt. Now, here's where most people get the story wrong. When we picture a woman hosting the great minds of the Enlightenment, we tend to imagine something soft and decorative, pretty dresses and polite small talk, while the real thinking happens somewhere else, among the men. That picture is comfortable, and it is almost entirely false. Running one of these rooms was not a hobby. It was closer to running a small, extremely delicate business, one built entirely out of trust timing and reputation. Choose the wrong guest, seat two rivals too close together, or let one bruised ego leave your table feeling humiliated and your entire Wednesday evening could collapse, along with years of careful work. The philosophers brought the ideas. Women like her built and guarded, the only room in Paris where those ideas were safe enough to say out loud. Twice every week her doors opened. Mondays belonged to painters and sculptors, men like Boucher and Van Loo and a younger, hungrier Greuze, all of them hoping for her attention, and more than a few of them depending on her money to survive between commissions. Wednesdays belonged to writers and philosophers instead. Over the years, that second guest list would grow to include names still printed on university course lists today. Diderot, d'Alembert, the playwright Marivaux, even a curious young Englishman named Horace Walpole, who crossed a sea and a language just to sit near the end of her table. It is worth pausing on that detail about the money because it says more about her than any guest list ever could. When Diderot's enormous, dangerous project, the encyclopedia, ran short on funding and support more than once, it was Marie-Thérèse Geoffrin quietly writing the checks, buying paintings from artists too proud to accept charity outright, covering debts nobody outside that dining room ever heard about. She never asked to have her name printed anywhere. She simply made sure the work could continue. Diderot himself, brilliant and famously careless with his own finances, leaned on exactly that kind of quiet generosity more than once help that never announced itself as charity, and arrived wrapped in nothing more dramatic than a dinner invitation. In the year 1755, something happened in that dining room that history chose to hold on to. A group of guests gathered for a performance of a new play, written by the most talked-about writer in Europe. Except the writer himself was not there. Voltaire was living in exile in Switzerland at the time, unwilling to risk setting foot back in Paris. So in his place sat a marble bust of his face positioned at the centre of the table, watching over an evening he never actually attended. The most famous man in the room, and he was made of stone. Someone painted that exact scene decades later. If you ever come across it, you will notice a dozen excited faces turned toward that bust, leaning in as if the marble itself might join the conversation. But look again just off to the side, slightly turned away from the performance and toward the room instead. There she is, Madame Geoffrin, not delivering a speech, not the centre of the painting at all, simply watching everyone else. Because watching quietly and constantly was the entire job. She never wrote a philosophical treatise of her own, never published a book with her name on the cover, and yet, for 3 decades she held more real influence over the intellectual life of Europe than most noblemen could ever claim, without raising her voice even once. How does someone build that kind of power by mostly staying silent, in a room full of men who had built entire careers out of never being silent at all by deciding, gently but absolutely, who got to speak and about what? If an argument in her drawing room ever grew too warm, if 2 brilliant, stubborn men began raising their voices over some idea dangerous enough to land a person in prison, she needed no dramatic outburst to stop it. A few calm words offered almost sweetly, and the whole room understood instantly that the subject was closed, not forbidden in anger, simply finished, the way a mother ends an argument between siblings without ever needing to shout. Compare that for a moment to the men's version of the same instinct gathered in the smoky cafes across the river, where disagreements were settled loudly, publicly sometimes with the challenge to a duel. Her way left no bruises, and somehow it worked far better, because 2 subjects never made it past her front door, not once in 30 years. The church was the first, the crown was the second. Talk all you like about beauty about a new play, about the strange machines being built to measure the stars, but say one careless word about God or the king, and you could feel the temperature of the room drop before you finished the sentence. At first, that might sound like nothing more than caution. A woman being careful because caution was expected of every woman in her position, and in part that is exactly what it was. But here's the detail almost nobody mentions when they tell this story. Because she protected that room so carefully, it became one of the only places in Paris where a servant's daughter and a duke could sit at the very same table, argue passionately about the nature of the human soul, and walk out afterward with their heads still very much attached to their shoulders, in a city where the wrong sentence spoken to the wrong person could end a career or a life. Her quiet, almost boring rule of no religion and no politics was not weakness. It was armour, and everyone sitting at that table, whether they admitted it or not, was safer because of it. Her husband, for what it's worth, passed away quietly in 1749. Her guest barely noticed. If we're being honest with each other, she barely noticed either. There were menus to plan, painters to feed, and half of Paris still waiting on an invitation that might never come. Now, we already know what most of the men at that table became famous for. Their names are still printed on the spines of books sold today, translated into languages they never spoke. But almost none of them could have built what they built without a woman like her sitting quietly near the middle of the table, making sure the whole evening never once fell apart. And maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment wherever you are tonight. So much of the most lasting influence in this world has never come from the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it comes from the person everyone forgets to paint at the centre of the picture, and who never once needed to be. She was only one of them too. Across Paris, on different nights of the week, other women were running entirely different kinds of rooms. Some were far gentler than hers, others were far more dangerous, willing to let a conversation wander exactly where Madame Geoffrain would have shut it down in a heartbeat. So before we go any deeper into what these women actually said once the door closed behind them, and trust me, some of it will surprise you far more than a marble bust at a dinner table. It helps to understand where this whole strange tradition began in the first place. Because long before Madame Geoffrain ever poured a single cup of chocolate for a philosopher, another woman in another century built the very first room like this one out of nothing more than a foul mood at court, and a flat refusal to keep quiet about it. And her story starts of all places inside a bedroom she never meant to become famous. That bedroom belonged to a young woman who had crossed an entire sea to get there married off at around 12 years old into a country whose language she was still learning, and a court she found almost immediately unbearable. Her name was Catherine de Vivonne. Born in Rome, raised among marble floors and quiet elegance, she arrived at the French court expecting something similar, and found instead a world that struck her as loud, careless, and more than a little crude. Nobles picked at their teeth during meals. Conversations turned coarse within minutes. Servants and lords alike spat sunflower seeds onto floors that were never quite clean to begin with. A woman's reputation could be quietly destroyed simply by having spent one evening in the wrong company laughing at the wrong joke. Catherine watched all of this, decided she wanted no part of it, and did something that on the surface looked like nothing at all. She stayed home, but staying home was not surrender, it was strategy. Instead of forcing herself through another evening at court, she began inviting a small, carefully chosen group of friends into her own bedroom. Instead, a room she had redesigned herself with walls covered in blue silk, at a time when nearly every fashionable room in Paris was dressed in deep red. The furniture sat low and close together, arranged so that no one towered over anyone else, so that conversation happened at eye level, instead of down a long, intimidating table. She likely never thought of it in these terms, but what Catherine de Vivonne built sometime around the year 1610 was one of the very first pieces of social engineering in modern European history. Long before anyone had a word for psychology, she understood that where people sit changes what they're willing to say. They called that room the Blue Chamber, and it belonged to a house known as the Hôtel de Rambouillet, which is why history remembers her today as the Marquise de Rambouillet. The word we now use so casually, salon, did not even exist yet. It would not enter the French language for another 5 decades, borrowed eventually from an Italian word for a large formal room. What Catherine built had no proper name, it simply worked. Poets came, Vincent Voiture, witty and famously difficult to sit next to if you had a fragile ego. François de Malherbe, a poet who spent years quietly reshaping the French language itself, insisting that clarity mattered more than ornamentation. A young girl still learning to write would sit somewhere in that same circle and eventually grow into Madame de Sévigné, whose letters people still read for pleasure centuries later. And a philosopher named La Rochefoucauld, who would go on to write some of the sharpest one-line observations about human nature ever put on paper, first tested many of those lines out loud in this very room on this very crowd. Here is the part I find worth sitting with for a moment. Inside that blue room rank at the door meant almost nothing once you crossed the threshold. A duke could be interrupted gently by a poet with no title at all, if his sentence was dull enough to deserve it. Wit outranked bloodline. For a society built entirely around inherited privilege, that alone was almost radical. Catherine de Vivonne never called herself a revolutionary, and she certainly never intended to start one. She just wanted better conversation than the court could offer her. Sometimes that is exactly how the biggest shifts in history begin, quietly, and for entirely personal reasons. It was in rooms like this one that guests began inventing small literary games to pass the evening, the kind of thing that sounds almost silly on paper, and turns out to be sharper than it looks. One favourite involved writing a short, unsigned character sketch of someone else in the room, praising and teasing them in the very same breath, then reading it aloud for the group to guess who it described. Getting the tone exactly right, flattering enough to avoid offence, honest enough to draw a laugh of recognition took real skill. Some of these written portraits survive today, collected decades later, into a small printed volume that historians still study for what it reveals about how these people saw each other and how carefully they had learned to say difficult things gently. The whole ethic behind it came to be seen as a kind of ideal, a polished graciousness that valued charm and self-control over raw cleverness for its own sake. 2.5 centuries later, when the rest of the world still associates French culture with a certain art of conversation, that reputation did not appear from nowhere. It was built quite literally one evening at a time inside a bedroom with blue silk walls. The regulars in her circle earned a nickname for their obsession with refined language and careful manners. People started calling them the précieuses, which translates loosely to the precious ones. And here is where the story takes a turn that I think says something timeless about how new ideas get treated, especially when women are the ones carrying them. Roughly 50 years later, a young, largely unknown playwright named Molière wrote a comedy mocking this entire movement, mercilessly turning every mannerism the précieuses valued into a punchline for a Paris audience to laugh at. The play was called The Ridiculous Precious Ladies, and it was a massive success. To this day, the word précieuse can still be used as a mild insult in French, aimed at anyone who seems a little too self-consciously refined, which means that some of the very first women in French history to demand serious respect for how they spoke and thought were remembered for at least a generation mostly as a joke. It is worth asking yourself quietly whether that pattern ever really went away. And notice something else while we're here, because it will matter again before tonight is over. Almost every history book written about this era for the next 200 years would happily credit the poets, the playwrights, the philosophers who passed through these rooms by name in detail with entire chapters devoted to their genius. The women who built the rooms chose the guests, and quietly kept the whole fragile arrangement from falling apart, usually earned at most a passing mention as a gracious hostess. Their names survive mostly by accident, tucked into someone else's letters, someone else's memoir, someone else's footnote. By the middle of the 1600s, Catherine's private experiment had stopped being private. Other women, first among the nobility, then increasingly among wealthy merchant families, began opening rooms of their own. The idea spread the way good ideas usually do, imperfectly, unofficially, one dinner invitation at a time, until by the time we reached the era, we spent our last hour inside the Paris of philosophers and encyclopedias and marble busts standing in for exiled writers. The tradition had already been quietly running for well over a century. Now here is where I want to be honest with you, because if you have watched enough documentaries or looked at enough paintings from this era, you have probably absorbed a version of these gatherings that is frankly a little too polished. Picture the image most of us carry around: elegant women in silk seated gracefully, distinguished men leaning in, captivated, discussing philosophy with perfect calm and mutual respect. Soft light, everyone charming, everyone kind. That image mostly comes from paintings made decades, sometimes a full century after the events they claim to show, often commissioned during a period when France, freshly exhausted by revolution and by Napoleon, was desperate to remember its pre-revolutionary past as something graceful and civilized, rather than the deeply unequal, occasionally brutal society it had actually been. Painting a beautiful memory is a very human thing to do after living through a nightmare. It does not make that memory accurate. What actually happened inside these rooms, according to the letters, diaries and complaints written by the people who were really there, was messier and honestly more interesting. There was gossip, plenty of it. There was gambling card games running late into the night with real money changing hands. There was flirtation, jealousy, alliances quietly forming and quietly breaking. Hostesses did not simply welcome whoever showed interest either. A brilliant guest who happened to be the talk of Paris that season might receive quiet, competing invitations from 3 different women on the very same evening, each one hoping he would choose her table over the others, each one keeping a mental ledger of exactly who had visited whom and how often. One French writer of the period, observing the whole scene with a slightly raised eyebrow, noted that most people walking through these doors were thinking less about philosophy and considerably more about simply being entertained. Beneath the wit and the candlelight, these were also deeply competitive spaces where 2 hostesses might quietly, viciously compete for the same brilliant guest the way modern companies compete over the same star employee. We're going to watch exactly that kind of rivalry play out later in this story, and I promise you it gets personal. There is even genuine disagreement among historians who have spent entire careers studying this subject about something as basic as whether politics was ever discussed at all. One well-known French writer insisted decades later that politics was carefully, scrupulously avoided in these rooms. Other historians reading the very same letters argue that politics was nearly the only thing anyone talked about, wrapped carefully in the language of literature and philosophy, so it would not sound like politics out loud. Personally, having sat with a fair number of these letters myself, I lean toward believing both of them were right, just about different houses on different streets in different decades. Some hostesses banned the subject outright, the way we already saw in that candlelit room on the Rue Saint-Honoré. Others let it in through the back door, disguised as a conversation about ancient Rome, or Greek philosophy, or the nature of virtue, so that everyone in the room understood exactly what was really being discussed, without anyone technically breaking any rules. By the time we reached the 1780s, under the reign of Louis XVI, Paris alone was home to something like 62 active salons running at once, some meeting daily, most meeting several times a week, gathering anywhere from 10 to 50 guests a session. Picture that for a moment. Dozens of rooms scattered across one city, functioning almost like a nervous system, carrying ideas, gossip, and information from house to house faster than any newspaper of the era could manage. Long before anyone had heard the phrase social network, Paris had already built one entirely by hand, entirely run by women. There is a simple, almost uncomfortable reason so many of these women threw themselves into building these rooms with such dedication. The universities of Paris did not admit them. The great academies that decided which ideas counted as serious scholarship did not admit them either, no matter how sharp their thinking. A woman could read every philosophy book ever printed and still never be allowed to sit for a single formal lecture on the subject. So the Salon became something close to a university built without permission, one where the entrance exam was simply an invitation, and the only degree that mattered was whether the most demanding minds in Paris kept coming back to your table. And that detail is worth pausing on because men of that era were not exactly starved for conversation either. They had their own equivalent informal gatherings in coffee houses and reading rooms where similar debates happened over similar questions. But those rooms had no single figure quietly managing the temperature of the conversation, deciding who spoke next, softening a wounded ego before it turned into a real grudge. Without that kind of invisible management, those male gatherings tended to run hotter, louder, and considerably more prone to collapsing into pure shouting, occasionally spilling out into a formal duel the next morning over an insult that inside a well-run salon would have been quietly diffused before dessert was even served. The very thing that made women's salons function this well, that constant, careful, almost invisible labour of managing people, rather than simply talking at them, has rarely been described in history books as a skill worth admiring. It usually just gets called being a good hostess. I've always found that a little strange, considering it may have been one of the most sophisticated social technologies of the entire century. So here is something worth carrying with you into the rest of tonight's story. If the sharpest conversations of an entire era were only possible because someone in the room was quietly constantly reading people, diffusing tension, deciding what could be said and what could not, doesn't that sound a little like intellectual work in its own right? Even if nobody at the time was willing to call it that quiet blue-walled room we started with tonight did not appear out of nowhere either. And neither, as it turns out, did the woman who once sat near the middle of that candlelit table on the Rue Saint-Honoré, watching everyone else with folded hands. Before she ever hosted a single dinner of her own, she spent years as a young guest in someone else's salon nearby, quietly studying a woman with a far more complicated, far more scandalous past than her own. A woman who'd once been a nun who left her convent under circumstances the church was not eager to discuss, and who, according to several accounts from the time, left a newborn son on the stone steps of a small Paris church rather than raise him herself. That abandoned child did not disappear into history. He grew up to become one of the sharpest mathematical minds the Enlightenment ever produced, and his name is still stitched into the very first pages of the encyclopedia we spent so much time with earlier tonight. Her name, in case every clue I just scattered through that last story already gave it away, was Claudine Alexandrine Guérin de Tencin, and if there is one person in this entire history who refuses to fit neatly into either the hero column or the villain column, it might be her. She was born in the city of Grenoble in the year 1682, the daughter of a fairly important legal official, and like a great many daughters of fairly important men in that century, her own wishes were never really part of the plan. Her family decided while she was still a child that she would become a nun, not because she showed any particular calling toward a quiet religious life, but because a convent was cheaper and simpler than arranging a proper marriage for every daughter in a large family. This was not some rare cruelty reserved just for her either. Across France in that century, sending a younger daughter into a convent, whether she wanted a religious life or not, was simply considered practical family finance, a way of keeping the family fortune intact for whichever daughter did manage a good marriage. So into the convent she went, and there she stayed, technically at least for years, quietly furious about it the entire time. Here is where her story starts to diverge from almost anyone else we've talked about so far tonight. Most women in her position accepted the arrangement. Claudine did not. While still formally wearing the habit of a nun, she's reported to have carried on a quiet romance with an exiled Irish soldier, a small, almost defiant rebellion that tells you a great deal about how seriously she took vows she never chose in the first place. She spent years afterward building a legal case for her own release, and in the year 1712 she actually won it, convincing the Pope himself to formally release her from her vows. Try to sit with that for a second. A young woman with no husband, no independent fortune of her own, yet successfully petitioned the single most powerful religious authority in Europe to let her walk out of a life that had been chosen for her without her consent. Whatever else you think of what came next in her story, that alone should tell you she was not someone the world was going to be able to quietly file away and forget. Once free, she moved to Paris, and Paris, for better and for worse, suited her perfectly. She was clever, ambitious, and by every account from people who actually knew her, almost impossible to outmaneuver in a conversation. She quickly attracted the attention of powerful men, several of them at more or less the same time, including a cardinal who would later become the most powerful minister in France, and eventually the regent who ruled the country itself during the young king's childhood. This was not a woman quietly waiting in the background of political life. She was actively shaping it, using her influence patiently and deliberately to help her own brother climb from a modest church post all the way up to becoming a cardinal himself. Letters from people who moved in her circle describe her sitting through entire evenings, barely touching her own dinner, watching instead who leaned toward whom, who avoided meeting, whose eyes filing every small detail away, like a woman playing a very long, very patient game of chess against an entire royal court. Ask yourself honestly for a moment whether that sounds like a woman simply enjoying dinner parties, or a woman running one of the most sophisticated political operations of her entire century, just without a single official title attached to her name. But it's one particular relationship with a cavalry officer known as the Chevalier de Touche that leads us to the part of her story most people find hardest to hear. In the autumn of 1717, Claudine gave birth to a son, and a few days later, under cover of night, she left that newborn baby on the stone steps of a small church near Notre Dame called Saint-Jean-le-Rond and walked away. I want to pause here because it would be easy for me to simply tell you that part of the story and move on, and I think that would do her and you a disservice. Understand what she was actually facing in that moment. She had already fought a public, difficult, deeply personal battle to escape a convent, and she had built an entirely new reputation for herself in Paris as a free, independent woman. A child born outside of marriage, especially to a woman with her particular history, threatened to undo every bit of that. Her own brother, whose career she had spent years quietly engineering, could have been ruined by the scandal alone. She was not a monster acting out of coldness. She was, by the account of pretty much every historian who has studied this moment, a frightened, calculating woman protecting the only kind of freedom available to her in a society that offered women almost none. That does not erase what happened to that child. It does explain it. And I think history is usually more honest and frankly more useful to us when we let both of those things sit next to each other instead of picking only one. The baby was found that same night by a police officer walking his rounds and given the name of the church where he was discovered Jean of the round church of Saint-Jean. Word reached his father fairly quickly, and to his credit the Chevalier d'Estouches did what Claudine had not. He tracked down his son, arranged for him to be raised by a humble glassmaker's wife named Madame Rousseau, and quietly paid for the boy's food, clothing, and eventually an excellent education. That boy grew up to become Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, one of the sharpest mathematical minds Europe would produce that entire century, and one of the two men who would later sit at the very centre of building the encyclopedia we've already spent so much time with in this story. Here is the detail that honestly still gets to me every time I read it. Once d'Alembert became truly famous, brilliant enough that all of Paris knew his name, his birth mother reportedly reached out, hoping perhaps to finally claim some part of the son she had once left on a doorstep. By every account he was polite to her, and he was also completely permanently loyal to the humble woman who had actually raised him. The glassmaker's wife he continued calling his true mother for the rest of his life, even after science and fame gave him every reason to walk away from that modest little household if he'd wanted to. Sometimes the family that matters is not the one written into the birth records. If you're listening tonight from inside a family that looks nothing like the one you were born into, I suspect you already understood that lesson long before I said it out loud. Claudine's own life, meanwhile, kept moving at the same restless, dangerous pace it always had. In the year 1726, a former lover of hers took his own life inside her house, in the middle of a bitter financial dispute between them. Claudine was accused of pressuring him, imprisoned first in one Paris jail and then transferred to the Bastille itself, a fortress, whose very name was enough to end most reputations permanently. Paris gossip that season assumed her finished, socially buried, done. She stayed there for months while the case against her was examined until her brother, the cardinal, she had worked so hard to help create, finally used his own influence to have the charges against her dropped. She walked out of the Bastille and almost unbelievably went right back to hosting dinners within the year, as if nothing at all had happened, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how difficult this particular woman was to keep down for long. And it was around this same period, starting roughly in 1718, and continuing for the next 3 decades, that Claudine's salon became one of the most talked about rooms in Paris, though calling it merely a salon almost undersells what she actually built there. Unlike the careful, tightly guarded rooms we've already visited tonight, Claudine's gatherings mixed cardinals with atheists, foreign diplomats with struggling poets, powerful ministers with philosophers whose books those same ministers were in theory supposed to be banning. Fontenelle came, Marivaux came, and in the year 1734, Montesquieu, working quietly on a book, examining exactly why great civilizations eventually collapse under their own weight, tested some of his earliest chapters out loud in her drawing room, watching her guests argue over exactly how much freedom a healthy society could actually survive before it either flourished or fell apart. It is worth knowing, if you happen to be listening from anywhere in the United States tonight, that those very same arguments about power corruption and the fragile balance a republic needs to survive would resurface decades later in the minds of men writing an entirely different country's founding, documents an ocean away. Ideas tested quietly over dinner in a Paris drawing room have a strange way of outliving every guest who ever sat at that table. According to people who spent time in her circle, Claudine had a habit, slightly wicked, undeniably funny, of referring to her own regular guests not as friends or colleagues or intellectuals, but as beasts kept and fed inside her own private menagerie. The English statesman Lord Bolingbroke, exiled from his own country, and grateful for anywhere interesting to spend an evening, was one of her more exotic specimens. So was a young, sharp-tongued writer named Grimm, who would later go on to send secret literary gossip about Paris to half the royal courts of Europe. I have to admit there is something almost affectionate about that description of hers once you sit with it for a moment. She was not pretending these brilliant men were her equals in some idealized meeting of minds. She knew exactly what she had built, a carefully curated zoo of Europe's most interesting animals, and she was without much apology. The keeper who decided who got fed and who got let inside the enclosure that week. If Madame Geoffrin's great skill was keeping a room calm enough that nothing dangerous ever got said out loud, Claudine's genius ran in almost the opposite direction. She built a room specifically designed so that dangerous ideas could survive contact with dangerous people. Cardinals hearing arguments that questioned the very foundations of the church. They served ministers, hearing critiques of a government they personally ran all of it, wrapped in just enough wit and hospitality that nobody quite felt comfortable storming out or reporting anyone to the authorities the next morning. Where do you imagine that kind of room is more dangerous to run, the one that bans every risky subject outright, or the one that lets every risky subject in the front door and simply trusts good manners to keep the whole thing from catching fire? She died in the winter of 1749, the very same year as it happens that Madame Geoffrin's own husband quietly passed away and left her free to fully step into the role she had clearly been rehearsing for years as Claudine's student and neighbour. One woman's story ending almost exactly where another woman's story was ready to begin in the same city, on streets close enough to walk between in a single afternoon. Step back for a moment and look at the three women we've now spent an entire evening getting to know. Catherine de Vivonne built her blue room out of a simple wish for gentler company than the court could offer her. Marie-Thérèse Geoffrin built her Wednesday dinners out of careful, patient caution, protecting a fragile space by keeping the most dangerous subjects locked outside the door. And Claudine de Tencin built her menagerie out of something else entirely out of ambition, out of a hard-won hatred of ever again being told what to do with her own life. Three completely different women, three completely different reasons for doing what looked from the outside like exactly the same thing. I think that is worth remembering the next time anyone tries to describe an entire century of women in a single tidy sentence. They rarely fit. We already know what Geoffrin chose to do with that opening because we sat inside her candlelit dining room together not too long ago tonight. She chose caution. She chose careful, deliberate silence on anything remotely dangerous and built decades of quiet influence on top of that discipline. But Claudine's approach never fully disappeared either. It simply moved down the street into other houses run by other women who found her particular kind of fearlessness a little more useful or a little more necessary than Geoffrin's caution ever was. Because the truth is, not every dangerous idea in 18th century Paris could survive being kept at a polite, careful distance forever. Some of them needed a room willing to let the fire in on purpose and trust that it could be managed. And there was one particular room run by a woman with almost nothing to lose and very little patience left for careful silence, where exactly that kind of fire finally openly refused to be put out. Her story starts fittingly enough, not with a birth or a marriage, but with a friendship that ended so badly it made the front rooms of Paris buzz for weeks, and a betrayal that oddly enough may have been the single best thing that ever happened to her. Every good origin story needs someone willing to play the difficult part at least for a while, and in this particular story that role fell to a sharp, aging woman named Marie-Anne de Vichy-Chambron, known across Paris as the Marquise du Deffand. By the 1750, du Deffand was already one of the most formidable hostesses in the city, running her own salon out of an apartment attached to a convent, entertaining diplomats and philosophers with a wit sharp enough that people thought twice before crossing her at dinner. She had lived in her younger years close to the court of the former regent himself, and carried into old age a kind of restless insomniac energy that made her infamous for staying up half the night dragging exhausted friends out for carriage rides through empty Paris streets simply because she could not bear the thought of sitting still with her own thoughts. but her eyesight was failing slowly at first and then with a kind of cruelty that made her depend more and more on someone else's eyes to keep reading, keep working, keep her afternoons filled with the letters and books she could no longer manage alone. That is when she remembered a young relative living in something close to obscurity, a woman named Julie working quietly as a governess for children who happened to be her own half-siblings, born into a complicated, painful family situation that had left her without money, without a proper name of her own, and without much hope of a life beyond that nursery. Julie had spent her whole childhood being reminded gently or otherwise that she did not fully belong in the household, raising her present at every family dinner, yet never quite counted as family in the way that mattered. Du Deffand, recognizing something sharp and alive in the girl during a visit, made her an offer. "Come to Paris, read to me, help me manage my evenings. In exchange, you will meet everyone worth meeting in France." Julie de Lespinasse said yes, and in 1754 she moved into the rooms directly above Du Deffand's own apartment, in a convent building that for the next decade would quietly become the site of one of the strangest and most human dramas the salon world ever produced. At first, everything went exactly the way you would expect. Julie read aloud, poured the drinks, learned the names and moods of every important guest who passed through, and in doing so absorbed an education most women of her century could never have dreamed of receiving any other way. But something else was happening too, something Du Deffand did not notice for a long time, mostly because her failing eyes could not actually see it happening right in front of her. Guests started arriving early. Not for Du Deffand, who usually rose late and joined her own evenings closer to the appointed hour. They arrived to sit instead in the small room upstairs, drawn by a young woman with none of the older hostess's rank, none of her fortune, and apparently, according to nearly everyone who left a written account of those years, an almost effortless gift for making brilliant, difficult men feel completely at ease. She remembered small details about people's lives that even their closest friends forgot. She asked the kind of questions that made a guest feel for the length of one conversation like the most interesting person in Paris. Word spread quietly through the city that the real conversation, the warmer, livelier one, was happening a floor above the official salon before the official salon had even begun. For 10 years this arrangement continued mostly unspoken, until in 1764 Du Deffand finally understood exactly what had been happening under her own roof the entire time. I do not think it is unfair to imagine how that must have felt. A woman who had built her entire identity, and increasingly her entire social life around being the most sought-after presence in that convent apartment, discovering that half of Paris had quietly, politely been choosing her blind, aging companion over her instead. Have you ever poured years of loyalty into someone only to find out all at once that the affection you thought was aimed at you had quietly been drifting somewhere else the entire time? Du Deffand's reaction might make a little more sense if you have. The argument that followed was by every account brutal. Julie was thrown out that same year with almost nothing, her decade of loyal service apparently counting for very little once jealousy took hold. Here is where I think this story stops being simply sad and starts being truly remarkable. Because Julie de Lespinasse did not fade quietly into disgrace the way society probably expected her to. With a little financial help, fittingly enough from a woman, we've already spent an entire evening getting to know Marie-Thérèse Geoffrin. Julie rented her own small set of rooms nearby and opened her own salon within months of being thrown out of her old one, and she built it on rules almost nobody else in Paris had tried before her. No twice-a-week formal dinners with elaborate courses. Instead, her doors opened every single evening from 5 until 9, with little more offered to guests than simple refreshments, and more importantly her complete undivided attention. It worked immediately. Nearly every brilliant mind who had once climbed those stairs to visit her, quietly before Dudefond's official evening began, followed her straight to her new address. There was no elaborate table here, no small army of servants arranging chairs by rank. Nothing close to the careful choreography we watched unfold in Marie-Thérèse Jeffrin's dining room earlier tonight. Just a few plain rooms, some bread and fruit, and Julie herself sitting at the centre of it, giving every guest the sense that whatever they had to say mattered enormously. Diderot came. The philosopher Condillac came. A sharp young economist and future government minister named Turgot came along with a mathematician named Condorcet, who would later help draft some of the founding language of modern human rights. According to more than one historian who has studied this exact rivalry, much of the hardest, most unfinished intellectual labour still needed to complete the encyclopedia. The actual grinding work of sorting through disagreements and half-formed arguments happened inside Julie's small rented rooms rather than anywhere grander. Think about what that means for a moment. Marie-Thérèse Jeffrin gave that enormous project money and protection. Claudine de Tencin in the previous generation gave dangerous ideas a political shelter, tough enough to survive contact with cardinals and ministers. But Julie de Lespinasse gave it something neither of the other two ever quite managed to offer: a room built entirely around rigour, where difficult men could disagree with each other, honestly sharpen each other's thinking, and leave having actually finished something. One of her earliest biographers, writing decades later, tried to capture the difference between these three remarkable women in a single short observation that has stayed with me ever since I first read it. People feared one of them, people deeply respected another, and people without much complication at all simply loved the third. That last part, the loving, is where Julie's story turns from inspiring into something far more painful. And if you are the kind of person who's ever cared for someone who could not quite love you back the way you needed them to, I suspect this next section will land somewhere close to home. The philosopher Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, whose own complicated origin we spent time with not long ago tonight, eventually moved into Julie's household, sharing her roof for years, devoted to her in a way that by every surviving account ran far deeper than simple friendship. When he fell seriously ill not long after joining her household, it was Julie who nursed him back to health herself, sitting up through long nights managing his medicine, refusing to leave his side until the danger passed. He adored her for it completely and permanently, and she gently, consistently never returned that particular kind of love, not in the way he clearly hoped she might, even while keeping him close as one of the most loyal companions of her entire life, because her heart, as it turned out, belonged somewhere else entirely, and then somewhere else again at almost exactly the same painful moment. A few years into running her own salon, Julie fell deeply, completely in love with a young Spanish diplomat's son named the Marquis de Mora, a love that remarkably he returned with just as much intensity. They wrote to each other constantly, sometimes twice within a single day, dreaming openly about a future together that his own family worked quietly and effectively to prevent seeing little value in a match with a woman of no fortune and a birth certificate built almost entirely out of fiction. And then his health began to fail. Tuberculosis. The same disease quietly stealing away so many lives across that century forced him back towards Spain, chasing warmer air and better doctors, leaving Julie behind in Paris with nothing but his letters and a slow mounting terror about what his silences might mean each time a delivery was late. It was during that very separation, while still writing devoted aching letters to a dying man she loved, that Julie met someone else. A military strategist and writer named the Comte de Guibert, confident, fashionable, already something of a celebrity in his own circles for a bold treatise he had written on modern warfare, and by nearly every account left behind by the people who knew him considerably less devoted to her than she quickly became to him. She fell for him anyway hard, even while her heart remained deeply tangled up in her promises to Mora. In the spring of 1774, the Marquis de Mora, sensing his own time running short, made the difficult journey back toward Paris, determined to see Julie one final time. He never arrived. He died along the way in the city of Bordeaux at almost exactly the same period Julie had already begun her new relationship with Guibert. Whether she learned the full timing of that painful coincidence right away, or only pieced it together later, her own letters describe a grief tangled so tightly with guilt that she could barely separate the two feelings anymore. And still devastatingly, her attachment to Guibert did not loosen. If anything, grief seemed to deepen it. She kept writing to him, kept hoping right up until the year 1775, when Guibert married another woman, entirely a decision that finally completely broke something in Julie that never fully healed again. Her health collapsed along with her spirit. She leaned on opium, a common and truly dangerous remedy doctors of that century reached for constantly to calm nerves and quiet pain, and by the spring of 1776 that combination of heartbreak and failing health finally caught up with her entirely. She died in Paris at just 43 years old. On her final night, she refused to let Guibert, the man who had caused her so much of that pain, anywhere near her bedside. Instead, it was d'Alembert, loyal to the very last hour, who sat beside her, still believing, as far as anyone can tell, that her deepest feelings over those final years had quietly belonged to him after all. It was only once her letters were discovered and eventually published decades later that the full, complicated truth of where her heart had actually spent those years came out into the open for everyone, including the people who had loved her, to finally read for themselves. I think what stays with me most about Julie de Lespinasse is not the tragedy of it, although there is plenty of that here if you want it. It is the fact that a woman with no fortune, no legitimate name, and no formal claim to any of it, built one of the most intellectually serious rooms of an entire century, purely out of attention, warmth, and an apparently unteachable gift for making people want to keep talking. She never wrote a treatise, never solved an equation, never sat on a single official academy. And yet by the time she died, some of the sharpest men in France would have told you without hesitation that her small rented rooms had shaped their thinking more than any lecture hall ever had. If you have ever wondered whether simply listening well to another person counts as a real skill, a real form of power in its own right, I think her whole strange, aching life is close to the best answer history has ever offered us. Not every brilliant mind who filled these rooms, though, was arguing about politics or nursing a broken heart over a letter that never came. Some of them were bent over strange glass instruments late into the night, timing falling objects, translating equations most of Europe could not even read yet, in the middle of exactly the same candlelit evenings we have been sitting inside all night. And the woman leading some of those experiments, it turns out, was every bit as fearless as anyone we have met so far tonight. Just in a language most of her own dinner guests could barely follow, working on a problem that would eventually help explain why the planets themselves refused to fall out of the sky. Her name was Gabrielle Émilie Le Tonnelier de Breteuil, though history mostly just calls her Madame du Châtelet. And unlike almost every woman we've met so far tonight, her story does not begin with an obstacle placed in her way. It begins unusually for that century with a father who decided to remove one. Emily was born in Paris in the final days of the year 1706 into a family wealthy and connected enough that her early cleverness could hardly be ignored. Most fathers in her position would have handed a daughter this sharp off to a convent school for a few polite years of embroidery and prayer, then arranged a suitable marriage, and considered the matter closed. Her father did something different. He noticed his daughter working through mathematics problems faster than the tutors he had hired for her brothers, and rather than quietly discourage it, he leaned in. He brought in instructors for fencing, for horseback riding, for Latin, for advanced mathematics, treating her education in almost every respect the way a wealthy family of that era would treat a promising son. It is worth asking yourself honestly, how many brilliant minds across that entire century simply never got the chance she was handed almost by accident, purely because the adult raising them made a different choice at exactly this moment. It clearly worked. By her teenage years, Emily could reportedly read Latin, Italian, and English fluently on top of her native French, and could hold her own in mathematical conversations that would have sent most grown men of her social class quietly out of the room. At 19, she married a soldier, the Marquis du Châtelet. In the arrangement, most young noblewomen of her century simply accepted without much say in the matter. They had 3 children together fairly quickly, and then as his military career pulled him further and further from home, Emily found herself with something rare for a woman of her position: considerable freedom, considerable money, and very little supervision. She used all 3 immediately and without much apology, throwing herself back into the dazzling social world of Paris, taking up gambling, taking up several lovers, and generally living the kind of life the more cautious hostesses we have already spent time with tonight would have quietly disapproved of. She was by most descriptions from the period tall-striking and utterly unwilling to shrink herself to fit anyone else's comfort. But underneath all of that restless social energy, she never actually stopped studying. She sought out serious mathematicians willing to tutor her privately, sometimes paying handsomely out of her own gambling winnings for the privilege absorbing ideas most of Paris considered entirely unsuitable reading material for a woman of her rank. Then, in 1733, she met a sharp, restless writer named Voltaire, already one of the most famous and most frequently in trouble men in France. Their connection was immediate, and it turned out to be considerably more than romantic. When Voltaire's writing landed him in danger of arrest the following year, it was Emily who offered him somewhere to disappear to her husband's crumbling, half-abandoned country estate at Cirey. Voltaire once complained, half joking, that Emily kept turning every door he planned into a staircase, and every staircase into a library, rebuilding the entire house around her own priorities faster than he could keep track of. What emerged from all that chaotic renovation, though, was not just a country retreat. It became one of the most serious private laboratories in all of Europe, filled with imported scientific instruments, thousands of books lining custom-built shelves, and 2 brilliant, stubborn people determined to understand exactly how the universe actually worked. Visitors who made the long journey out to Cirey described finding Emily in the middle of the afternoon covered in ink, deep in calculations, entirely unbothered by whether her appearance matched what a marquise was supposed to look like while entertaining guests. Here is a story about her that I happen to love mostly because it tells you everything about who she actually was underneath the reputation. In the late 1730s, the French Academy of Sciences announced a prize competition on the true nature of fire, a genuine unresolved scientific mystery, at the time one that touched on chemistry, physics, and plenty of guesswork all at once. Voltaire decided to enter working late into the night at Cirey, burning and weighing different materials, trying to measure fire itself as though it were an object with real countable weight. Emily watched him work for weeks quietly, forming her own quite different theory in the back of her mind. And then, without telling him, she began writing her own entry, working alone after Voltaire had gone to sleep, keeping a bowl of ice water beside her desk so she could plunge her hands into it whenever exhaustion threatened to pull her under in the small hours of the morning. She finished it just before the deadline and submitted it in complete secrecy, telling no one, Not even a man sleeping down the hall who assumed he alone was racing that particular clock. Neither of them won. But when the Academy later published the full list of everyone who had entered the competition, Voltaire discovered for the first time that his own partner had secretly been racing him the entire time and had very nearly beaten him to it. I like to imagine that conversation. Do you think he was flattered or a little wounded, possibly both honestly and probably in roughly equal measure? From there, Emily's work only grew more serious. In 1740, she published a book called Foundations of Physics, written on its surface as a simple textbook for her own young son, though anyone who actually opened it quickly discovered something far more ambitious underneath. In careful, patient chapters, she worked to reconcile two rival schools of physics that most of Europe's leading minds insisted could never be combined, the ideas of Isaac Newton and the ideas of a German philosopher named Leibniz. She went on to argue in a public dispute with one of the most senior officials at the French Academy of Sciences itself, a man who had spent decades building his own reputation on the opposite position, that a moving object's energy depends on the square of its velocity rather than simply its speed, an argument. Modern physics ultimately proved entirely correct. She did not back down when he pushed back publicly in print, and she did not soften her mathematics to spare his feelings either. Her correspondence with serious mathematicians across Europe, men like Johann Bernoulli and a rising young talent named Leonhard Euler, treated her in writing at least as an equal worth arguing with honestly. And here is where I want to pause on something that still frustrates me a little even 3 centuries later. The very Academy she was publicly successfully arguing with never once considered admitting her as a member. Women were simply not allowed inside that particular door, no matter how correct their mathematics turned out to be. She could out-argue their own secretary in print in front of all of Europe, and still never be permitted so much as a seat in the room where those arguments technically got decided. Doesn't it feel strange even now that history remembers the argument she won far better than it remembers the institution that refused on principle to ever let her officially join it? Her greatest work, though the one still sitting on serious library shelves today, was still ahead of her. Starting around 1745, Emily committed herself to translating Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, his massive, notoriously difficult masterpiece on gravity and motion, out of its original Latin and into French, adding her own detailed mathematical commentary, alongside it expanding sections Newton himself had left frustratingly brief for anyone without decades of training. Almost nobody in France at that point could actually read Newton's original work with real understanding. Emily set out to fix that single-handedly, spending years buried in calculations most trained mathematicians of her own era would have found exhausting, all while continuing to run a household, raise children, and maintain a social life. Half of Paris still watched closely for the next scandal. Now here is where her story turns quietly and then very suddenly toward its ending. In 1748, well into her 40s by that point, Emily began a relationship with a younger poet named Saint-Lambert, an arrangement Voltaire himself remarkably seemed to accept with more grace than jealousy, the three of them settling into a strange, workable, thoroughly unconventional understanding that suited all of them better than anyone watching from the outside probably expected. Not long after Emily discovered she was pregnant, a seriously dangerous prospect for a woman her age in that century, and by every account from people close to her, she knew it. She wrote to a friend plainly and without much self-pity, admitting she did not expect to survive the birth. There was no panic in the way she described it. From what survives of her letters, only a kind of clear-eyed practicality, the same instinct that had guided nearly every decision of her adult life. If time was truly running short, she was not going to spend what remained of it in bed feeling sorry for herself. Rather than slow down, she sped up. In the final months of her pregnancy, Emily worked days, reportedly stretching to 17 hours at a stretch, racing to finish her Newton translation before whatever was coming for her arrived first. Picture that for a moment a woman in her final weeks of pregnancy hunched over calculus by candlelight, treating a translation of physics as though it were the single most urgent task left in her entire life. In a strange way for her, it may well have been exactly that. On a September night in 1749, while sitting at her desk working by most accounts on Newton, she felt the first signs of labour and gave birth that same night to a daughter. For a few days afterward, it seemed as though she might actually be fine well enough that Voltaire and Saint-Lambert both allowed themselves a cautious kind of relief. Then 6 days later, she died from complications that doctors of the time had almost no ability to treat. She was 42 years old. Her infant daughter would not survive much longer than she did, dying less than 2 years later. A second quiet tragedy history rarely bothers to mention in the same breath as the first. Her manuscript, the one she had raced an entire pregnancy to complete, survived her, though it was left in a state only a fellow mathematician could finish properly. A brilliant young colleague named Alexis Clairaut spent years afterward preparing it carefully for publication, treating her unfinished pages with the same seriousness he would have given any respected academic peer. It was published years later, and it remains even now the standard French translation of Newton's Principia, the version French readers still turn to centuries after nearly every other name from that academy dispute has faded into footnotes. Voltaire, grieving in his own complicated way, wrote afterward that his companion had been, in his own words, something close to a great mind, whose only real flaw the world could ever find in her was simply having been born a woman. I think about that line more than I probably should, because if you strip away every unfair assumption packed inside it, what he was actually admitting, whether he fully realized it or not, is that the only thing standing between Emily du Châtelet and being remembered exactly like Newton or Leibniz or any of the other men she spent her life quietly out-arguing was never her mind at all. It was simply everyone else's willingness to look past what she happened to be born as. She did not need permission to be brilliant. She only ever needed the rest of the world to catch up to what she already knew about herself. If you've ever finished something important while everyone around you quietly doubted you had the right to attempt it in the first place, I suspect a small part of you already understands exactly how she must have felt racing candlelight and time itself toward one final unfinished sentence. Her own private life, by the way, an accepted lover, an understanding husband, a devoted former partner, all sharing space around the same dinner table, without much scandal at all, would have shocked plenty of drawing rooms across Europe if word of it travelled too far. And yet inside the rooms we've been sitting in together all night, an arrangement like that barely raised an eyebrow. Which leaves us with a question worth carrying into whatever comes next tonight. If salons like these could calmly accept a woman living quite so far outside the official rules of marriage, what did the women inside them actually believe in their most private, unguarded conversations about love itself, about desire, and about whether marriage and happiness were ever really meant to be the same thing at all? To answer that question properly, we actually have to step backward in time a little past every woman we've already met tonight, all the way back to a girl born in Paris in the year 1620, roughly a decade before Catherine de Vivonne ever redesigned her first bedroom into something the world would later call a salon. Her name at birth was Anne de l'Enclos, though almost nobody in history remembers her by that name. Her father nicknamed her Ninon when she was still small, and Ninon is the name that eventually became legendary across every corner of French society, whispered with equal parts admiration and scandal for the better part of a century. Her parents could not have disagreed more completely about how to raise her. Her mother was devoutly religious, determined to shape a properly modest, properly obedient daughter, the kind who would marry well and disappear quietly into someone else's household. Her father, a musician with little patience for convention, taught her. Lute taught her horseback riding, and introduced her early to a school of ancient philosophy built around a fairly simple idea that pleasure honestly pursued was not something to be ashamed of. The two influences pulled at her from opposite directions for most of her childhood, until circumstance settled the argument for her. When her father was exiled from France after a duel, and her mother died a decade later, young Ninon found herself quite suddenly with no parent left to please, answerable to absolutely no one but herself. She made a decision at that point that would define the rest of her extraordinarily long life. She would never marry. To understand how radical that choice actually was, it helps to understand what marriage legally meant for a woman in her century. The moment a French woman married in nearly every practical sense, her property became her husband's property, her income became his income to manage, and her legal identity was folded quietly into his own. A dowry negotiated by her father would pass almost entirely into her husband's control the moment the ceremony ended, and a wife who found herself unhappy or mistreated or simply bored had remarkably few legal paths back out of the arrangement. A wealthy, well-connected woman could still marry into comfort, certainly, but comfort and control are not always the same thing, and Ninon, watching the women around her navigate that particular trade, carefully decided she preferred a version of freedom most people considered scandalous over a version of security most people considered respectable. So instead she became what her century called a courtesan, choosing her own companions, carefully accepting gifts and support from the men she spent time with, but never allowing herself to depend financially on any single one of them for long. It is worth pausing on that distinction for a moment, because it is easy for modern ears to hear the word courtesan and picture something purely transactional. Ninon herself seemed to understand her own position rather differently, closer to an independent businesswoman managing her own assets than anything resembling ownership in either direction. She reportedly liked to say that seducing someone honestly took considerably more real cleverness than commanding an entire army, a line delivered from what survives of her reputation with a perfectly straight face. By the 1660s, Ninon had largely stepped back from that earlier chapter of her life and turned her attention towards something that would end up mattering far more to history, an intellectual salon of her own, hosted from a modest house on a quiet street that could comfortably fit only a small, carefully chosen crowd, nothing like the sprawling formal dinners we watched Marie Geoffrin orchestrate decades later. And what a crowd it turned out to be. The playwright Molière came along with the poet Scarron, and eventually a young dramatist named Racine, all of them treating her rooms less like a courtesan's parlour and more like one of the sharpest philosophical classrooms in Paris, a place where a joke about human vanity might land harder and land truer than an entire sermon on the same subject. Here is where her story becomes truly useful for understanding the broader question we're actually asking tonight. Ninon did not simply live outside the rules of marriage. She talked about it openly, constantly treating love itself as a subject worthy of serious philosophical attention, rather than something a respectable woman was supposed to quietly endure or quietly hide. She argued to anyone willing to listen that love conducted honestly between equals, without pretending it was something more spiritual or more permanent than it actually was, produced far less unhappiness than love, forced into the shape marriage usually demanded of it. Young noblemen, and quite a few young noblewomen too, apparently sought her out specifically for advice on exactly this subject, treating an afternoon in her company as something close to an education in how to navigate desire honestly, without losing either your dignity or your independence in the process. She was in a sense running an informal school, where the entire curriculum revolved around conversation restraint timing and the difficult art of wanting someone without disappearing into them entirely. It is not the kind of curriculum any official academy of her century would have recognized, and yet plenty of the men who went on to shape French literature for the next 100 years apparently considered an afternoon in her drawing room every bit as valuable as a semester anywhere else. That kind of talk did not go unnoticed by the authorities of her time. In the year 1656, the Queen Regent, disturbed by rumours of Ninon's growing influence over the young nobility circling her drawing room, ordered her confined for a period inside a convent, the same institutional solution we have already watched used against more than one woman in this story tonight, though this time deployed less as protection and more as outright punishment. It is worth noticing for a moment how often that particular building kept reappearing across these women's lives, a convent wall standing in again and again as society's default answer to a woman whose voice had grown a little too loud, a little too persuasive for comfort. Ninon was released fairly quickly, reportedly, thanks to the intervention of powerful friends, including, according to some accounts, a visiting foreign queen who valued her conversation considerably more than she feared her reputation. She lived to be 84 years old, remaining sharp, financially independent, and apparently just as capable of holding an entire room's attention in her final years as she had been at 20, an achievement worth sitting with for a moment in a century that treated aging women, especially unmarried ones, as socially invisible at best. And here is the detail I find almost impossible to get through without smiling every single time I come across it. In her final years, Ninon left a small sum of money in her will for the education of a 9-year-old boy, the son of her own notary, a child she had apparently taken a liking to during his family's visits, charmed by every account by his obvious wit even at that young age. That boy grew up to become Voltaire, the very same restless writer who decades later would fall into an entirely different and considerably more famous intellectual partnership with the woman we spent so much time with earlier tonight. Before Émilie du Châtelet ever met him, before Cirey, before Newton, a small piece of Voltaire's earlier schooling was quietly paid for by a woman who had spent her entire adult life refusing to let any man legally own a single coin she earned. I think that detail says something almost poetic about how these women's stories keep circling back on each other across an entire century, even when they never actually met one woman's stubborn independence, quietly financing the education of the very man who would later help immortalize another woman's genius in physics. Now, more than half a century after Ninon's death, a rather famous philosopher in a completely different country used her life to make an entirely different point. Immanuel Kant, writing about beauty and morality, pointed to Ninon as proof of just how brutally unequal that century's standards really were. A man could conduct himself exactly as freely as she had, take as many lovers, refuse marriage entirely, and simply be called worldly, even admired for it over a good dinner. But suggest to a woman like Ninon that she lacked virtue, and by every account she would have been furious at the accusation, even though her own choices matched almost point for point the very behaviour society quietly tolerated, even celebrated in men. Kant was not necessarily praising her. He was pointing out with the cold clarity philosophers are usually good for that. An entire century had built two completely different rule books, depending only on which body you happened to be born into, and had somehow convinced most people that this arrangement counted as natural rather than simply convenient for whoever benefited from it. Isn't it a strange kind of tribute being remembered mostly as evidence in someone else's argument about fairness? Ninon's own honesty about love, uncomfortable as it made plenty of her contemporaries, eventually settled into something close to an open secret across the entire aristocratic world she left behind. By the time the candlelit rooms we spent most of tonight inside came into fashion, a fairly consistent, if rarely spoken aloud pattern had quietly taken hold among wealthy French couples. A marriage happened first, arranged by families, negotiated like the property transaction. It mostly was built around dowries and titles, and the practical business of producing an heir to carry the family name forward. Only once that obligation was satisfied did many husbands and wives, by mutual and largely unspoken agreement, feel free to seek out actual affection somewhere else entirely, provided discretion was maintained and appearances at church and court remained intact. It was not celebrated exactly, but it was understood, the way everyone in a room understands an inconvenient truth nobody particularly wants to say out loud at dinner. By the time we reach the more familiar rooms we have been sitting inside tonight, Geoffrin's careful dinners, Tenson's dangerous menagerie, Julie de Lespinass's small daily gatherings, Ninon's blunt, unapologetic philosophy of love had already quietly seeped into how an entire generation of Salon women thought and spoke about marriage in private, even if almost none of them would have said so out loud in front of the wrong company. Marriage, most of them understood, clearly existed to secure property-produce heirs and satisfy family alliances. Love, if you were fortunate enough to find it at all, usually had to be pursued somewhere else entirely, carefully, quietly, and on terms a woman had actually chosen for herself, rather than terms chosen for her at the negotiating table before she'd even met the man in question. That is not cynicism, by the way, at least not the way most of these women seem to understand it. It was simply an honest accounting of the actual bargain being offered to them, and a quiet refusal to pretend the bargain was something warmer than it really was. Some, like Émilie du Châtelet, negotiated that bargain openly with a husband's apparent blessing, and a former partner still welcome at the same dinner table. Others kept the arrangement carefully hidden, visible only in letters, never meant for publication, the way we saw with Julie de Lespinass's aching devotion to men who could never quite give her what she needed in return. And some, like Ninon herself, simply refused to enter the bargain at all, choosing a harder, lonelier kind of freedom over a softer, better-funded kind of constraint. Which raises a question worth sitting with for a moment before we move on tonight. If you had been born into that century, into that particular bargain, do you think you would have accepted the comfortable version of the arrangement? Or would you have gambled the way Ninon did on something riskier but entirely your own? There is no obviously correct answer here, and I suspect the honest response depends less on courage than on how much a person actually had to lose by choosing the harder path. Whatever any individual woman actually decided about love, one thing remained true across every single house we've visited so far tonight. Nothing that happened behind those doors stayed behind those doors for very long. A private conversation at 10 in the evening could be common knowledge across half of Paris by the following afternoon, carried not through anything as clumsy as shouting in the street, but through something far quieter, far more deliberate and considerably more dangerous to anyone who underestimated it. A network of folded letters, borrowed servants and carefully worded notes passed from one drawing room to the next, long before anyone had ever heard the word telegraph. That network actually had a name, and more surprisingly it had one very particular woman quietly sitting near the centre of it, for almost 30 years doing work so discreet that most of Europe's crowned heads never even learned her name while she was doing it, reading her judgments about Parisian culture and mistaking them every single time for someone else's voice entirely. She was born Louise Florence Pétronille Tardieu d'Esclavelle in the town of Valenciennes in the year 1726. Her father, an army officer, was killed in battle when she was only 9 years old, and her mother, left alone and apparently uninterested in the task, gave her daughter's education about as much attention as you would expect from a woman who considered the whole subject faintly beneath her. Louise later described her own upbringing as something closer to neglect than parenting, learning most of what she actually knew from books she found on her own, rather than anything a tutor bothered teaching her. At 19, she married her own first cousin, a young tax collector with a comfortable fortune and, as it turned out fairly quickly, absolutely no interest in fidelity. Within a few years, his affairs and his reckless spending had become impossible to ignore, and Louise did something that plenty of unhappy wives in her position simply were not able to do. She took him to court, and in the year 1748 she won a legal separation of property, securing her own independent finances, at a time when most married French women had almost no legal standing to attempt anything of the kind. With that hard-won independence, Louise settled into a country estate called La Chevrette, in a quiet valley just north of Paris, and began filling it with exactly the kind of company you would expect, by now writers, philosophers, and a small circle of close friends who gave each other private, faintly ridiculous nicknames, calling themselves bears of all things in their letters to one another, an inside joke. Apparently nobody outside the group ever fully understood or was meant to. It was here through a lover who would later become the grandfather of a rather famous novelist herself, a young woman named George Sand, who would not be born for decades yet, that Louise met a restless, brilliant and famously prickly writer named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. She liked him enough to build him an entire cottage on her property, a modest little house at the edge of her park that she called the Hermitage, 5 or 6 simply furnished rooms with a garden and a spring, exactly the kind of quiet retreat a man who distrusted crowds and craved solitude could have asked for. Rousseau moved in during the spring of 1756 and began writing one of the best-selling novels of the entire century right there among Louise's gardens. It was also through this circle that Louise met a sharp, ambitious German writer living in Paris named Melchior Grimm, a friendship, and eventually a lifelong partnership that would end up mattering considerably more to history than anyone at that dinner table probably realized at the time. Grimm, it turned out, had quietly built something remarkable, a handwritten newsletter copied out by hand specifically to slip past French censors, and mailed twice a month to a tiny, carefully selected list of subscribers scattered across the courts of Europe. We're not talking about minor subscribers either. Catherine the Great of Russia read it. Frederick the Great of Prussia read it. A scattering of German dukes and princesses read it too, all of them paying handsomely for the privilege of knowing exactly what Paris was thinking, arguing about and gossiping over weeks before any official newspaper would dare print a word of it. The pages covered new plays, new books, philosophical arguments still too dangerous to publish openly occasional court scandal, and threaded quietly through nearly every issue, a running commentary on which Parisian minds were currently worth paying attention to, and which had already fallen out of fashion. For a prince sitting in a palace hundreds of miles from Paris, this handwritten letter was in a very real sense his window into the most exciting intellectual capital in Europe. And for nearly 30 years, the only woman writing for that newsletter on a regular basis was Louise d'Épinay. Grimm's newsletter was not even entirely alone in this business either. Paris in that century supported an entire quiet industry of handwritten news sheets, nicknamed by contemporaries as nouvelles à la main, literally news by hand, copied and recopied by professional scribes and passed along to subscribers hungry for exactly the kind of unofficial, uncensored information the printed press was forbidden from touching. Getting caught, producing or distributing the wrong kind of handwritten news could land a person in real legal trouble, since the French crown took the unauthorized circulation of political rumor considerably more seriously than most of us might assume today. Grimm's own newsletter survived for decades, largely because it stayed just clever enough and just far enough outside French borders once copied to avoid that particular danger, even while carrying opinions plenty of officials in Paris would have preferred stayed quietly unwritten. Sit with that for a moment, because I think it is easy to read past it too quickly. While Grimm travelled, which he did often, sometimes for months at a stretch, it was Louise, sometimes working alongside Diderot, who kept that entire secret channel of information running, reviewing new plays, summarising philosophical arguments, and occasionally quietly deciding exactly which piece of Parisian gossip was interesting enough to travel all the way to a palace in St. Petersburg. Her contributions went out unsigned, folded into Grimm's own voice so seamlessly that most subscribers likely never realised a woman's judgment was shaping their picture of French culture at all. A queen halfway across a continent might form her opinion of an entire French play, or an entire French argument about religion, based partly on sentences this one woman had chosen to write down on a particular Tuesday evening, sentences nobody outside a very small circle would ever know had come from her pen. That is what I mean when I say reputation in these rooms functioned as an actual currency. It was not simply about who liked whom at a dinner party. Information itself, carefully selected, carefully worded, and carefully aimed at exactly the right reader, could travel further and land harder than almost anything shouted publicly ever could. Louise understood this instinctively, which makes what happened next between her and Rousseau all the more painful to watch unfold. Their friendship soured within a couple of years of his moving into the Hermitage, tangled up in jealousy, misunderstanding, and Rousseau's own growing infatuation with Louise's sister-in-law, a woman named Sophie d'Houdetot, who did not return his feelings no matter how many increasingly desperate letters he sent her way. Rousseau isolated out in his little cottage, and already prone to imagining conspiracies against him. Even on his best days grew convinced that Grimm and Louise were somehow plotting behind his back, whispering about him in rooms he was no longer invited into. He accused them of turning his own friends against him. He accused Louise of inviting him to the countryside more out of social obligation than real affection. None of it was especially fair, and by nearly every surviving account quite a lot of it was simply Rousseau's own suspicious nature working itself into a frenzy over very little. But fairness rarely slows down a genuine falling out once pride gets involved on both sides, and by the end of the decade the friendship had collapsed entirely. Old friends turned into permanent enemies, the way only people who once trusted each other completely seem capable of becoming. Years later, Rousseau began writing his Confessions, an extraordinarily candid memoir that word quickly spread through Paris would include some distinctly unflattering portraits of the people who had crossed him, Louise very much among them. He had already started giving private readings of the manuscript aloud to small gatherings around Paris, testing sections on friends, building anticipation, letting rumours of exactly how unflattering it might be spread ahead of publication, the way gossip always seemed to travel fastest in this world. And here is where her story stops being simply sad and becomes something closer to inspiring, at least to me. Rather than sit quietly and wait to see how badly her reputation might suffer once his book made the rounds. Louise petitioned the city's own lieutenant of police directly, laying out her case plainly, and succeeded in having Rousseau's public readings of the manuscript stopped before they could spread any further through Paris society. Think about what that actually required, a woman using the machinery of the state itself to defend her own name against a man's unpublished version of events, walking into an office of actual government authority and asking successfully for a private grievance between two former friends to be treated as a matter worth official intervention. That is not passive damage control. That is someone who understood exactly how reputation moved through her world, who it travelled through, and who refused to simply stand still and let someone else's story become the only version anyone remembered. She did not stop there either. With quiet encouragement from Grimm and Diderot, both of whom had their own reasons to dislike how Rousseau might portray them, Louise spent years writing her own account of those very same events, a lightly fictionalized memoir she called The Story of Madame de Montbriand, in which a character clearly modelled on Rousseau appears in a considerably less flattering light than he ever painted himself. It went unpublished during her lifetime, considered too pointed, too personal, too dangerous to print while everyone involved was still alive to argue back. It did not see daylight until decades after her death, edited, trimmed, and eventually printed as her memoirs for readers who by then had no personal stake left in who had wronged whom. But she wrote it anyway, an entire counter-narrative constructed carefully in private on the simple, correct assumption that whoever controls the story eventually controls how history remembers the people trapped inside it. She spent her final years writing of all things careful guides on educating children, publishing a set of conversations built around teaching her own granddaughter Emily arguing patiently against the harsh, restrictive methods so common in her century, and in favour of curiosity, kindness, and treating a child's questions as worth answering honestly. The work was serious enough that the French Academy itself, the very institution still refusing to admit a single woman as a member, awarded it a prize for the most beneficial book published that year. She received the news in January of 1783. She died 3 months later, having spent her entire adult life writing for an intellectual world that welcomed her contributions eagerly, while never once considering handing her the formal credentials it handed to considerably less careful thinkers, provided they happened to be men. It is a strange kind of justice being formally honoured by an institution that would never have let you through its front door as anything other than a guest. I find myself wondering whether she felt any satisfaction reading that announcement, or whether by that point in her life the recognition arrived a few decades too late to mean quite what it might have meant to the younger, more hopeful version of herself who first arrived at La Chevrette, determined to build something of her own out of a marriage that had given her almost nothing worth keeping. Have you ever felt someone else's version of a falling out slowly become the only version anyone else believed, while your own side of it sat quietly unread in a drawer somewhere waiting for a reader who might never come? I suspect quite a few of you know exactly that feeling, and I suspect Louise d'Épinay understood it better than almost anyone in this entire story so far, which may be exactly why she refused to let it happen without a fight. Everything we have talked about tonight, the secret newsletters, the careful letters, the counter-memoirs written in private and read decades later, all of it depended on one thing. These women understood with total clarity that how you looked, sounded and appeared in public carried exactly as much weight as anything you actually said out loud in that same room. A single word chosen carelessly could travel from Paris to St. Petersburg inside 2 weeks, folded into Grimm's little envelopes. And it turns out an outfit, a hairstyle, or the particular fabric draped across a woman's shoulders could travel almost as fast, carrying messages just as loaded to anyone in that century who'd actually learned how to read them. There was one particular language spoken fluently in every single room we've visited so far tonight that had almost nothing to do with words at all, and everything to do with silk powder and the very specific, very deliberate choices women made each morning before they ever opened their front door to a single guest. Silk, it turns out, could say things a woman was never permitted to say out loud, and once you learn to read it, you start noticing that entire conversations were happening across these candlelit rooms that never once required a single spoken word. Let's start with something small enough to miss entirely if you were not looking for it. A tiny scrap of black silk or velvet cut into the shape of a crescent moon, a star, or sometimes just a plain little circle, and pressed carefully onto the skin of the face. The French called these little scraps mouches, which simply means flies, a name chosen precisely because against skin powdered to a deliberately unnatural porcelain white, a small dark patch really did resemble an insect that had simply landed there and stayed. By the middle of the 1700s, wearing one or several was considered an absolutely essential part of getting dressed for the evening, right alongside the powder and the perfume sold in decorated little boxes women carried with them, the way we might carry a compact mirror today, so a patch could be repositioned mid-evening if the conversation or the company took an interesting turn. Here is where it gets interesting. Where exactly you placed your mouche was not left to chance. Near the corner of the eye, it supposedly signalled passion. Set high on the forehead, it carried an altogether more commanding, majestic sort of message. Tucked just below the lower lip, it was considered quietly discreet, a small deliberate suggestion rather than an announcement, while one placed directly beside the mouth altogether earned the nickname the coquette, worn by women perfectly happy to let a little flirtation show. Historians studying old-fashioned manuals and letters from the period do not always agree on the exact meaning attached to every single position. The way gossip about a trend tends to shift depending on which drawing room you happen to be standing in that particular decade, but the underlying idea shows up again and again across the sources. A woman's face itself had become a kind of readable surface, and everyone fluent in the fashion of the moment understood, instantly and without a single word passing between them, roughly what she was trying to say. It got even more specific than flirtation too. An engaged woman was expected to wear her mouche on the left side of her cheek, and once she married, she moved it quietly over to the right, a tiny, wordless update to her own personal status that anyone paying attention would immediately understand. And this was not only a French habit either. Cross the Channel into England during the same century, and the very same little patches took on a completely different kind of meaning entirely. Female supporters of one political party wore their patches on the right side of the forehead. Supporters of the opposing party wore theirs on the left, which means if you can picture it for a moment, a woman could walk into a crowded London drawing room and announce her entire political allegiance before she had said a single sentence to anyone in the room, using nothing more than a scrap of black silk the size of a fly. One imagines the occasional disaster too, a patch slipping in the heat of a crowded ballroom, quietly relocating itself to the wrong side of a woman's face, and sending entirely the wrong political message to a room full of people more than happy to notice and gossip about it later. Doesn't that completely rearrange how you picture these rooms? We have spent this entire evening imagining conversation as something that happened only through spoken words, careful sentences, letters folded and passed along in secret. But an enormous amount of communication in these rooms was happening silently, visually encoded directly onto the surface of a woman's own body, readable only by people who already knew the code. Now, if mouche were a whispered kind of language, what came next on top of a fashionable woman's head was closer to a headline printed in enormous, unmissable type. By the 1770s, aristocratic hairstyles in France had grown so tall, so architecturally ambitious that some women reportedly could not fit through a normal doorway, standing fully upright, and had to duck or occasionally kneel inside their own carriages with their heads pressed out the window, just to get from one house to another without collapsing an entire evening's worth of careful hairdressing. Picture the sheer logistics of that for a moment, an entire household, rearranging itself, door frames, measured carriage seating, renegotiated all, so one woman's hair could survive the journey intact. These towering constructions were called poufs, sometimes rising 2 or 3 feet above a woman's own scalp, and the most talented hairdressers of the era did not simply pile hair upward for the sake of height. They built entire scenes up there, tiny sculptural stories balanced on wire frames, cushions and horsehair padding, then woven carefully through with a woman's own natural hair to hold the whole fragile architecture together for an entire evening of dancing, dining and conversation. One of the most famous examples celebrated a moment of genuine medical courage. When the French king agreed to be inoculated against smallpox, a disease that had killed plenty of European royalty and terrified nearly everyone else, a procedure still viewed with real suspicion by much of the public. Despite growing evidence of its benefit, his wife commissioned a poof to mark the occasion. Rising out of her hair sat a golden sun, a nod to an earlier king remembered as the Sun King himself, alongside an olive tree heavy with fruit representing peace, with a serpent wound through the branches, a classical symbol of medicine and healing, borrowed straight from ancient mythology. A woman wearing that hairstyle to a salon that season was not simply showing off. She was wearing quite literally the news of the week, a walking advertisement for a controversial medical procedure encoded directly into her own hair, for anyone in the room to read and discuss over dinner, whether they approved of inoculation or considered it reckless meddling with nature. Hair was not the only architectural problem these fashions created either. The wide-hooped skirts fashionable across many of these same decades, called panniers, could extend a woman's silhouette several feet out on either side, wide enough that walking through an ordinary doorway sideways became a genuine skill, and wide enough that furniture in a proper drawing room sometimes had to be rearranged specifically to accommodate however many women happened to be seated at once. Think back to the careful, deliberate seating arrangements we talked about earlier tonight, servants placing chairs exactly where a hostess wanted them rank, and reputation quietly dictating who sat where. Now imagine trying to manage all of that delicate social choreography while also making sure 5 or 6 enormous silk skirts could actually fit around the same table without a single seam getting crushed. Hosting a proper salon, it turns out, required not just social intelligence, but something close to architectural planning. Another famous poof appeared shortly after a French naval victory against the English, complete with a miniature ship sailing across a sea made entirely of carefully arranged curls. Imagine walking into a room today wearing a hat shaped like a rocket the week after a major space launch, and you start to get a sense of exactly how current, how deliberately topical these towering hairstyles were actually meant to be. Women were not simply following a trend handed down from above. They were actively choosing which stories, which victories, which controversies deserved a place on top of their own heads that particular season, competing in their own quiet way to be the most current, the most clever, the most politically attuned woman in the room. Here is the piece of this I find worth sitting with a little longer than the rest. In a century where women could not vote, could not hold office, and could not publish political opinions under their own name without real risk to their reputation, hair and fabric had quietly become one of the only public platforms available to them. If you wanted to announce which side of a medical controversy you supported, or which military victory made you proud, or in England, which political party had your loyalty, your hairstyle or your beauty patch might be the only publicly acceptable way to say so out loud, in a room full of people who would absolutely notice and absolutely talk about it afterward. That is not shallow. That is resourcefulness dressed up as vanity, because vanity was the only category society was willing to let it live inside of comfortably. Of course, none of this came without real cost, and I do not think it is honest to tell this story without saying so plainly. The pale porcelain complexions so fashionable across these salons was often achieved with the paste made partly from a poisonous white metal, the very same toxic ingredient once used in house paint, applied thickly day after day, slowly poisoning the very women wearing it, in pursuit of a look meant to signal leisure refinement and a life untouched by common labour. Some accounts from the period describe skin damage, hair loss, and worse among women who relied on it for years, the very beauty meant to communicate status quietly, working against the body underneath it the entire time. Beauty in this particular century was frequently purchased with a woman's own long-term health, a trade most of them were never fully told they were making, and one it is worth remembering whenever we are tempted to look back at these fashions as simply charming or eccentric, rather than seriously dangerous. And underneath all of this glittering excess, a quieter, more philosophical argument about fashion itself was also unfolding inside these very same salons. The philosophers gathered around Diderot and Rousseau increasingly argued that all of this, the towering hair, the thick white paint, the enormous hooped skirts wide enough to require their own specially designed doorways, represented everything wrong with a corrupt, artificial aristocratic culture, more interested in appearance than in honest virtue. Real virtue, they argued, looked simple, natural, unpowdered. A woman who wanted to signal her sympathy with these newer, more radical Enlightenment ideas could do so again without saying a single political word, simply by showing up in a plain muslin dress, with her own natural hair loosely arranged rather than the elaborate architecture fashionable a generation earlier. It is worth noting the irony here, since the very queen who commissioned that inoculation poof would, within a decade, cause an entirely different scandal by appearing in a portrait wearing exactly this kind of simple, white muslin dress, criticised by traditionalists at court for looking, in their words, more like a servant than a monarch, even as reform-minded observers praised her for finally embracing honest simplicity over aristocratic excess. The same woman managed to scandalize two completely opposite factions within a single decade simply by changing what she wore, which meant that by the final decades before the revolution, a woman's entire appearance walking into a salon had become something close to a political statement, whether she intended it that way or not. Powdered and towering, she signalled old aristocratic confidence, wealth secure enough to survive an evening in 3 feet of borrowed hair. Simple and natural, she signalled sympathy with the very ideas that would eventually help bring that aristocratic world crashing down entirely, whether or not she fully understood on the night she chose that particular dress exactly how loaded a plain piece of white cotton was about to become. Have you ever gotten dressed for a specific room, choosing your outfit less for comfort and more because you knew exactly what message it would send to the people waiting for you inside? If so, you already understand better than you might realize exactly what these women were doing every single morning, centuries before any of us were born, turning a mirror and a wardrobe into one of the only newspapers they were ever allowed to publish under their own name. France, of course, never had a monopoly on any of this. Silken patches and simple muslin dresses might have started their political careers in Paris, but the moment you cross the Channel into England or travel further east into the German states, you find women running entirely different kinds of rooms, speaking entirely different languages of their own, sometimes in English, sometimes with none of the aristocratic Polish we have grown used to in Paris, and occasionally with far higher intellectual standards attached to admission than any French hostess ever dared demand. Everything we have watched unfold in Paris tonight was really just one especially loud chapter in a conversation happening in candlelit drawing rooms across an entire continent. Cross that channel with me for a moment, because the very first stop on the other side of it involves possibly my favourite origin story in this entire evening, and it starts of all places with a pair of cheap wool stockings, In London, in the early 1750s, a small group of society women led by a sharp, independently wealthy hostess named Elizabeth Montagu grew tired of watching their friends waste entire evenings hunched over card tables, losing small fortunes at gambling instead of actually talking to one another. So Montagu began hosting something different, gatherings built entirely around conversation ideas and books with cards quietly, deliberately left out of the invitation altogether. One of the regular guests at these evenings was a modest scholarly botanist named Benjamin Stillingfleet, a man whose conversation everyone apparently adored, and whose wardrobe, thanks to a fairly thin income, left something to be desired. As the story goes, when Stillingfleet worried aloud that he lacked the proper formal black silk stockings expected at a proper evening gathering, one of the hostesses waved the concern away entirely, telling him to simply come in his ordinary blue worsted stockings, instead the everyday wool ones he already owned rather than anything bought specially for the occasion. He did, and on the evenings he could not attend, the rest of the group reportedly complained that conversation simply was not the same without him joking that they could do nothing without their blue stockings. The nickname stuck first to him personally, then to the entire gathering, and eventually, once women began to outnumber the men at these evenings, to the circle of women themselves. That is how an entire intellectual movement in English history ended up permanently named after one poor scholar's cheap socks. If you ever needed proof that history's most lasting labels rarely arrive with the dignity we assume they must have had at the time, I think this one settles the argument nicely. Elizabeth Montagu, who the writer Samuel Johnson affectionately crowned the queen of this whole circle, ran her gatherings on money that came from an unglamorous but extremely reliable source coal mines up in the north of England that her husband's family owned. She was by most accounts a remarkably shrewd businesswoman herself, taking a direct hand in managing those mining operations, rather than simply collecting income from a distance the way most aristocratic wives of her century would have. When she was widowed in the mid-1770s, she used that fortune not to retreat quietly into mourning, but to build an entire mansion in London complete with a grand room specifically designed to host these gatherings on a much larger scale than the modest evenings she had started decades earlier, and to fund the publication of women writers who otherwise would have struggled to find anyone willing to print their work at all. She had her own particular theory about how a room should be arranged too, seating her guests in one large semicircle, rather than the long formal tables favoured across the Channel in Paris, specifically so that no single voice could dominate a corner, while everyone else strained to listen from the far end. It is a small detail, admittedly, but I find it fascinating how differently these two national traditions solved almost the exact same problem, keeping brilliant competitive people talking productively instead of shouting over one another using nothing more sophisticated than the shape of a room and the arrangement of a few dozen chairs. And in a detail that will sound entirely familiar by this point in the evening politics, was firmly consistently kept off the guest list of acceptable topics at Montagu's gatherings. To the exact same unwritten rule, we watched Marie-Thérèse Geoffrin enforce in her own dining room, apparently invented independently, an ocean and a language apart by two women who never once discussed the matter with each other. Montagu did not simply host conversations either. She picked fights, intellectual ones, and she picked a remarkably audacious one. In the late 1760s, she published an entire book defending the playwright Shakespeare against harsh criticism from, of all people, Voltaire himself, the very same restless French writer whose marble bust once presided silently over a Paris dinner party we visited earlier tonight, and who spent considerable energy across several decades arguing that English theatre, Shakespeare included, was crude, undisciplined, and beneath the polished standards of French classical taste. Montagu disagreed publicly, systematically, chapter after chapter, and in print under her own name, becoming one of the loudest English voices insisting that her country's most celebrated playwright deserved serious literary respect, rather than polite European condescension from a man who, by her own account, had clearly never bothered reading him carefully in the original language to begin with. It is worth pausing on that image for a moment, an Englishwoman running her own intellectual circle across the Channel, taking on one of the most famous men in Europe over the honour of a playwright who had already been dead for more than a century, and largely winning the argument in the eyes of her own countrymen. Here is the part of this story that I think carries a quieter, sadder lesson underneath the charm. For roughly 2 decades, the word blue-stocking meant exactly what Montague and her friends had built it to mean: serious, respected, admirable, a badge worn with pride by women proud of their own minds. And then gradually, the way we already watched happen, once tonight, to an entirely different group of clever women a century earlier in France, the word curdled. By the early 1800s, a blue-stocking had quietly become an insult. A woman considered too learned, too opinionated, too obviously intelligent to be properly marriageable, the kind of woman polite society warned young men to avoid rather than seek out. One well-known critic of the era went so far as to call the blue-stocking the most objectionable figure in society, someone who dragged an entire room down simply by being present in it. The exact same pattern, admiration curdling into mockery once these women's success became too visible to ignore, comfortably apparently did not need a shared language or a shared coastline to repeat itself. It just needed enough time and enough uncomfortable men to notice how much space these women had quietly begun taking up. Now, if you think that pattern sounds discouraging, let me take you somewhere else entirely, to a city where the obstacles standing in front of these women were considerably steeper than fashionable snobbery, and where the women who broke through them anyway deserve, I think, even more credit for managing it. Travel further east into the German states to the city of Berlin, and you find a society considerably more rigid than either Paris or London. There was no real salon tradition here yet, and no university even existed in the city until well into the following century. Class lines were sharply legally enforced aristocratic titles, mattering in ways they had already begun to loosen slightly in fashionable Paris. Middle-class women were expected to occupy themselves with household and religious duties and little else besides, and Jewish families, regardless of wealth or education, lived under real legal restriction and constant social suspicion, excluded from universities, from most professions, and from nearly every room polite Christian society considered acceptable for mixing socially. And yet, beginning in the 1780s, some of the most celebrated gathering places in the entire city belonged to Jewish women. Henrietta Hertz was engaged at just 12.5 years old to a physician nearly twice her age, a serious, well-educated man named Marcus Hertz, who had studied directly under the philosopher Immanuel Kant. It was on paper exactly the kind of arrangement we have watched define so many of these women's lives tonight, decided by families negotiated around money and status rather than affection. But rather than treat his young fiancée as simply a future household manager, Marcus began guiding her education seriously from the moment of their engagement, handing her books, correcting her writing, treating her curiosity as something worth cultivating, rather than something to be politely tolerated. Once they married, the two of them started hosting lectures and physics demonstrations in their own home gatherings that quickly began attracting a startling range of guests, young noblemen visiting princes, and Christian intellectuals who would never ordinarily have set foot inside a Jewish household for any social reason whatsoever. Henriette turned out to have a gift for exactly the kind of hosting we have spent this whole evening exploring, warm, curious, endlessly capable of making a room full of strangers feel like old friends within minutes of arriving. Her home became one of the liveliest intellectual meeting points in the entire city, mixing nobility with commoners and Christians with Jews, in a way that by every account from the period simply did not happen anywhere else in Prussian society at the time. She personally taught Hebrew to a young, restlessly curious traveller named Alexander von Humboldt, a man who would go on to become one of the most celebrated explorers and scientists of the following century, carrying pieces of what he learned in her drawing room all the way to South America and back. She was not alone in this either. A close friend of hers, a woman named Rahel Varnhagen, ran a different kind of gathering nearby, less focused on formal lectures, and considerably more interested in raw searching conversation about human character itself, drawing figures ranging from poets to a Prussian prince into her own small rented rooms. Where Henrietta's evenings felt closer to a school built out of genuine affection, Rahel's felt closer to a kind of ongoing intimate confession, guests treating her less like a hostess and more like someone capable of understanding them more clearly than they understood themselves. Both approaches worked in their own very different ways, which tells you something important about hosting a room like this, that there was never only one correct formula, only different women finding whichever version of hospitality happened to fit their own particular gifts. Between the two of them, and a handful of other Jewish women running similar gatherings across the same short stretch of years, Berlin briefly became home to some of the only truly mixed social spaces in the entire German-speaking world, built and held together almost entirely by women who were by the law of their own country considered second-class citizens the moment they stepped back outside their own front doors. Sit with that comparison for a moment because I think it deserves it. In Paris, women ran these rooms despite being excluded from formal education and formal power because of their gender alone. In London, they ran them despite snobbery about what a proper marriageable woman was supposed to spend her time thinking about facing ridicule rather than legal restriction. And in Berlin, women built the exact same kind of room while facing gender exclusion and religious persecution, stacked on top of each other at the very same time with considerably less legal protection than either of their French or English counterparts, and somehow still managed to gather princes and philosophers under one modest rented roof. Have you ever built something meaningful specifically because every official door in front of you happened to be locked at the time? If so, you're in good company tonight, standing alongside women on 3 separate coastlines who never met each other, never read each other's letters, and somehow arrived at almost exactly the same solution anyway, proving something worth remembering long after tonight's story ends, that a locked door rarely stops a determined woman from building an entirely new room of her own next to it. But of all the rooms we have visited across an entire continent tonight, none of them would prove quite as fragile as the ones we started this evening inside. Because the very city that invented this whole tradition in the first place was about to tear itself apart so completely that it would take nearly every one of these candlelit rooms down along with it, and turn the gentle art of conversation itself into something dangerous enough to cost a person their head. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room once everyone inside it realizes the rules they have been living by no longer apply, and Paris by the summer of 1793 was absolutely full of that silence. The candles were still burning in plenty of drawing rooms across the city. The chairs were still arranged carefully the way we've watched so many hostesses arrange them tonight. But the entire structure of trust holding those rooms together, who could be invited safely, who could be trusted not to repeat a careless sentence to the wrong person, the next morning had begun quietly collapsing underneath all that familiar candlelight. The woman whose story carries us into this part of tonight was born Marie-Jeanne Flippon, the daughter of a Paris engraver, a bright, restless girl who spent her childhood devouring exactly the kind of books that had shaped nearly every mind we've spent time with this evening, Rousseau most of all. As a teenager, she reportedly wept with frustration, reading about ancient Roman republics, wishing she'd been born a citizen of one instead of a girl in 18th century Paris, with almost no formal path toward the kind of public life those old republics at least offered their sons. She married a man 20 years older than her, an economist named Jean-Marie Roland, chosen less for affection and more for his intellect, and his standing and arrangement that by this point in the night should sound entirely familiar to you. History remembers her as Madame Roland, and unlike nearly every woman we have followed so far tonight, her story does not end quietly, decades before anything truly dangerous happened to the world she lived in. Her story ends right in the middle of it. By 1791, Madame Roland had moved to Paris with her husband and opened her own salon, except this one looked almost nothing like the candlelit dining rooms we spent our earlier hours inside tonight. There was no ban on politics here. Politics was the entire point. Her rooms became the meeting place for a group of moderate revolutionaries who would eventually be known as the Girondins men, debating late into the night exactly what kind of country France should try to become now that the old one had been torn open, arguing over constitutions, over the fate of a king still technically sitting on his throne, over how much of the old world deserved saving, and how much deserved to burn. For a while, even men who would later become her executioners sat comfortably at her table. Robespierre himself was an early welcome guest in those rooms, before the widening gap between moderate and radical revolutionaries turned nearly everyone who had once shared a dinner together into potential enemies instead. When her husband was unexpectedly appointed to a senior position in the new government in 1792, Madame Roland's influence did not shrink into the background the way custom might have expected. She drafted his correspondence. She shaped his political memoranda. She sat in on his meetings, took his notes, and by more than a few accounts quietly steered decisions that history would later attach only to his name. Multiple historians who have studied their partnership closely have suggested that a great many of his better decisions actually originated with her, filtered through him simply because the law of her country would not permit a woman to hold the position herself. It is worth pausing here to notice something we have circled back to more than once tonight. Even at the absolute centre of a revolution built on new ideas about liberty and equal citizenship, a sharp, capable woman still needed a husband's name attached to her own thinking before the world would take it seriously. That did not protect her for very long. As the revolution radicalized, splitting into fiercer and fiercer factions, the moderate Girondins Madame Roland had spent years cultivating fell dramatically out of favour, accused fairly or not of being too cautious, too compromising, too willing to negotiate with a monarchy. The more radical factions wanted gone entirely and immediately. In June of 1793, she became the first prominent member of that faction, arrested during what history now calls the Terror, hauled from her own home and imprisoned inside an old abbey turned improvised jail, its cellars, according to more than one account, damp enough that water from a nearby river seeped directly through the stone walls of her cell. She spent the following months writing her own memoirs by candlelight, a woman fully aware by every account of exactly how her story was likely to end, determined to make sure her own voice survived the telling of it, regardless of what happened to the rest of her. Those pages, smuggled out of prison before her trial, remain one of the most vivid first-hand accounts historians have of those exact months, written by someone with every reason to soften her own image for posterity, and remarkably little interest in doing so. When she finally faced the revolutionary tribunal, witnesses described judges so wary of her skill, with words that they reportedly limited her to short, simple answers, rather than risk letting her speak freely in her own defense, an odd backhanded kind of compliment from the very people about to sentence her to death. Here is a small detail from those final months that I think says more about her than almost anything else could. On the same day she finally faced trial, another prisoner stood alongside her, a frightened ordinary printer with no particular political importance at all, simply caught in the same violent machinery she'd been swept into. When the moment came, Madame Roland asked that he be executed first, so that he would not have to endure the horror of watching her die before facing his own end. Even standing at the absolute edge of her own life, her instinct was still to manage the room, to soften what could be softened for someone else, the exact same instinct that had made her salon and every salon we have visited tonight function in the first place. On the 8th of November 1793, Madame Roland was guillotined in a public square in Paris, dressed by most accounts simply and calmly, refusing any show of fear for the crowd gathered to watch. Witnesses reported that on her way to the scaffold she passed a plaster statue erected nearby to represent liberty itself and turned toward it one final time. What she said next has come down to us in more than one slightly different version, but every account agrees on the essential shape of it, an acknowledgement delivered with something closer to grief than anger, that the very ideal she had spent her adult life defending had somehow been twisted into an excuse for exactly the kind of violence she had always argued against. 2 days later, her husband, already in hiding, learned of her death and ended his own life rather than face a world without her in it. I want to sit with that phrase for a moment longer because I think it is the single most important idea buried inside this entire hour of our story tonight. An ideal, however good, however true, is never automatically safe from the people who claim to be acting in its name. That is not a lesson only worth remembering about the 1790s in France. Have you ever watched something you deeply believed in get twisted slowly by people insisting they were only trying to protect it? If so, Madame Roland's last clear thought before the blade fell might land closer to home tonight than you were expecting from a story like this one. Her death was not an isolated tragedy either. It was one execution inside a much larger, much colder piece of legal machinery that had been specifically built only months earlier to make rooms exactly like hers illegal in practice, even when no formal law technically banned them outright. New wartime legislation passed in the autumn of that year, remembered today as the law of suspects, made simply being suspected of insufficient revolutionary loyalty grounds. Enough for arrest, no solid evidence required, no clear crime necessary, no meaningful path to appeal once the accusation had been made. Tens of thousands of people across France would eventually be swept up under exactly that standard before the worst of the terror finally burned itself out. And what exactly looked more suspicious to an anxious, paranoid government than a room full of educated people gathering regularly behind closed doors, exchanging ideas nobody outside that room could fully monitor? The very quality that had made salons so valuable for over a century, their privacy, their independence from official oversight, was precisely the quality that made them look to a frightened revolutionary government like potential nests of conspiracy. One by one, the great rooms we might have expected to survive this moment quietly closed their doors instead. Hostesses who had spent decades cultivating careful, powerful friendships suddenly found those same friendships as dangerous as owning the wrong book. Some fled the country entirely, crossing borders into England, into the German states, into whatever corner of Europe still felt safe enough to whisper freely, in leaving behind houses, libraries, and years of correspondence they no longer dared to even carry with them. Germaine de Staël, daughter of a former finance minister and heir to one of the last great salons of the old order, escaped into exile rather than wait to discover how the new government might eventually treat a woman with her particular history of influence. She would go on years later to build an entirely different kind of gathering out of that exile. But that story belongs somewhere else in this evening. Others stayed and watched their entire world dissolve around them without ever leaving their own city. Sophie de Condorcet, wife of the mathematician and philosopher, whose ideas about equality had helped shape the very revolution, now devouring people like her, spent the terror selling paintings and sewing to survive after her husband was forced into hiding, eventually dying. Most historians believe rather than face the guillotine himself. The rooms she had once filled with careful conversation about liberty and human rights emptied out, entirely replaced by the far more urgent business of simply staying alive. Others did not run in time or chose, like Madame Roland, not to run at all. Wealth that once bought protection now bought suspicion instead. A noble title that once opened doors now closed them, sometimes permanently. The very qualities, careful conversation, wide connections, patient cultivation of powerful friends that had made these women some of the most influential people in an entire century, briefly became reasons to fear for their lives instead. Isn't there something almost unbearably ironic about that? For more than 100 years, these rooms had quietly nurtured nearly every idea that eventually fed the revolution itself. Questions about liberty, about equality, about whether inherited privilege deserved the respect everyone had always simply assumed it deserved. And then when those very questions finally succeeded in tearing the old world down the rooms that had incubated them, were among the very first things the new world decided it could no longer afford to trust. By the time the worst of the terror finally exhausted itself roughly a year after Madame Roland's death, the particular world we have spent this entire evening exploring candlelit dinners, careful seating charts, secret newsletters folded into diplomatic pouches, towering hairstyles built to announce the news of the week had been shaken apart so thoroughly that it could never fully reassemble itself the same way twice. Some of these women died on the same scaffold Madame Roland did. Some escaped into exile and quietly rebuilt entirely new kinds of rooms in entirely new countries. Some simply outlived the danger watching from whatever safety they could find, as the world they had spent decades shaping finally violently insisted on remaking itself without asking their permission. So here is the question worth carrying with you as we come to the end of tonight's journey. When something this fragile, this dependent on trust conversation and careful human relationships gets swept away, this quickly, does it actually disappear, or does it simply find a new shape to survive inside? Because the story of what came next, of the handful of women who refused to let this entire tradition die quietly along with the century that invented it, might be the most surprising chapter we have saved for last tonight. That surprising chapter belongs to a woman who spent her entire childhood sitting quietly in the corner of somebody else's salon, absorbing every lesson these rooms had to teach, long before she ever hosted an evening of her own. Her name was Germaine Necker, and her mother Suzanne ran one of the most celebrated gathering places in Paris throughout the 1770s and 1780s. The same tradition of careful conversation and curated guest lists we have spent this entire evening exploring. As a young girl, Germaine sat at the edge of her mother's drawing room and listened to some of the sharpest minds in Europe argue, flatter, and occasionally humiliate one another over dinner, absorbing almost by accident an education most girls of her century could never have dreamed of receiving, meeting, visiting Americans and travelling diplomats before she'd even reached her teenage years. Her father, meanwhile, spent years serving as the finance minister to the French king, a position that put the entire family close enough to real political power to understand exactly how fragile that power actually was. By 20, Germaine had married a Swedish diplomat in an arrangement built entirely around convenience rather than affection, and almost immediately afterward opened a salon of her own, For a while her story followed a familiar shape. Her rooms gathered reformers who believed the monarchy could be improved rather than destroyed entirely, men debating constitutions and rights, in exactly the tone we watched Madame Roland's circle adopt not long ago tonight. When the terror finally arrived, Germaine did what she could to protect the people she loved, spending considerable money and no small amount of personal risk helping frightened aristocrats slip quietly out of a city that had suddenly turned lethal for anyone with the wrong last name. She survived where others did not, retreating for a time to her family's estate in Switzerland, a quiet lakeside chateau called Coppet that would eventually become far more important to this story than anyone in her family could have guessed at the time. Once the worst of the terror had burned itself out, Germaine returned to Paris and reopened her salon, and it is here that her story stops rhyming with anyone else's we have told tonight, and starts becoming something entirely new. Because the next figure to walk through her door, quite literally through the introduction of a mutual friend, was a rising young general with an unmistakable talent for ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte visited her rooms more than once in those early years, and by every surviving account the two of them never much liked each other. She found him controlling, suspicious of independent thought, uncomfortable with any woman who spoke as freely and as publicly as she did, treating conversation itself as a kind of territory to be conquered rather than shared. He found her increasingly to be a problem, a woman whose drawing room had somehow become one of the only places in France where his own policies could be openly, intelligently criticised sometimes by his own brothers, who apparently enjoyed her company rather more than their sibling would have preferred. Napoleon had spent years tightening his grip on every newspaper and publishing house in the country, shutting down dozens of political papers until only a handful loyal to him remained. A room full of clever, well-connected people talking freely without his permission or his censorship must have felt to a man building an empire on absolute control almost unbearably threatening. By the time Napoleon crowned himself, Emperor Germaine had become something close to his most persistent, most articulate domestic critic, dismissing him in her own writing as a man hostile to ideas themselves, uncomfortable with anything he could not personally control. In October of 1803, Napoleon had finally had enough. He issued an order forbidding her from living anywhere near Paris at all, banishing her from the entire heart of the country she loved most over nothing more than persistent conversation, and a stubborn refusal to soften her opinions for the sake of a general's comfort. When she first heard the news of her own banishment, she's said to have remarked with the same dry composure that seemed to define her entire life, that Napoleon had handed her a rather cruel kind of fame, and that she would now occupy at least one permanent line inside his own history books, whether he liked it or not. Time, at least, has proven her entirely right about that particular prediction. Here is where most stories like this one would end quietly. A brilliant woman silenced her rooms, emptied her influence, extinguished the way we watched happen to so many others just one chapter ago tonight. Germaine instead packed her belongings, travelled to that same lakeside chateau at Coppet, and built something considerably larger than anything Napoleon had actually intended to allow her. Coppet under her direction became an international meeting point unlike anything Paris itself had produced in decades. Every single day her table was set for roughly 30 guests, a rotating, overlapping cast of exiled politicians, foreign princes, and some of the sharpest writers in Europe, all of them drawn there specifically because Napoleon's own aggressive expansion across the continent had made honest, open conversation about his rule almost impossible to find anywhere else. Benjamin Constant, her longtime companion, and one of the era's sharpest political thinkers, became a near-permanent fixture. A German scholar named August Wilhelm Schlegel, moved in as well, tutoring her children and helping introduce an entirely new artistic movement, one he had helped name himself to a French-speaking audience that had never encountered anything quite like it. Her closest friend, a famously beautiful salonière named Juliette Recamier, visited so often and stayed so long that Napoleon eventually banished her too for the apparent crime of simply enjoying Germaine's company. One French writer, reflecting on the scene not long after her death, described her chateau as something close to the unofficial headquarters of European thought itself, which, considering exactly who kept showing up there uninvited by Napoleon's wishes, does not sound like much of an exaggeration to me at all. Napoleon did not simply tolerate this arrangement from a safe distance either. In 1810, Germaine published a serious study of German culture, philosophy and art, a book that on its surface looked like nothing more than literary criticism, an appreciative look at foreign poetry and foreign ways of thinking about feeling and imagination. Napoleon read it entirely differently correctly, sensing that praising a foreign country's intellectual life, especially one built around individual feeling and independent thought rather than order and discipline, amounted to a quiet indictment of everything rigid and centralized about his own empire. He ordered the entire French printing 10,000 copies in total seized and destroyed before a single one could reach a bookshop, the physical pages themselves pulped into nothing, rather than risk a single French reader encountering the idea that another culture's way of thinking might have something worth admiring in it. The book would not be legally available in France again until after his own downfall 3 years later, finally published first in England instead, out of reach of his own censors entirely. Doesn't that tell you something remarkable about how seriously an emperor commanding armies across an entire continent took one woman's opinion of German poetry? You do not send soldiers to pulp 10,000 books over an idea you consider harmless. The persecution only escalated from there. Napoleon's police began intercepting her letters, opening her correspondence before it ever reached its destination, tracking exactly who came and went from her chateau on any given week. Visitors to Coppet found themselves exiled from France simply for the crime of having spent an evening at her table, Schlegel among them, along with several of her closest friends, a punishment specifically designed to isolate her by making her own hospitality dangerous to anyone who accepted it. She was eventually confined to the chateau itself, forbidden from travelling more than a short distance in any direction, watched constantly by agents reporting her movements back to Paris. In one surviving letter to his own police minister, Napoleon ordered in language considerably more crude than I am willing to repeat to you directly, that this particular woman never be allowed anywhere near his capital again, an extraordinary amount of imperial attention to spend on a woman whose only weapon in the end was conversation. In the spring of 1812, with Napoleon's own army preparing to invade Russia, Germaine finally decided she had endured enough. She slipped away from Coppet under the pretense of a short outing, taking only a small party with her, and instead began an extraordinary secret journey east through Austria into the exact same Russian territory Napoleon's soldiers were about to march through in the opposite direction, before finally reaching safety in England after passing through Sweden. It is a strange, almost cinematic image, a middle-aged French woman and her small travelling party racing across a continent one step ahead of an invading army, passing through cities that would soon be burning all because she refused to stop talking about ideas an emperor found inconvenient. She later wrote her own vivid account of that journey, describing the strange, tense excitement of arriving in a city that fully expected an invading force to reach its gates within weeks. From England and later from Sweden, Germaine spent the following years doing everything within her considerable power to help unite the rest of Europe against Napoleon, using every connection, every ounce of the very same social skill this entire evening has been built around meeting with king's ministers and generals who all seem to find her worth listening to despite, or perhaps because of, everything Napoleon had done to try to silence her. More than one biographer has since credited her, at least in part, with helping stitch that alliance together, turning years of careful, patient hospitality into something that ultimately looked remarkably like a functioning diplomatic network run entirely by a woman with no official title and no government position of her own. Think about that for a moment. The tradition of candlelit conversation, we began this whole story inside the same tradition a revolutionary government once treated as dangerous enough to guillotine women over had, within a single generation grown powerful enough to help topple an emperor who commanded most of a continent by force alone. She finally returned to Paris in 1814 once Napoleon's first fall had made it safe to do so, though she found the city changed in ways that disappointed her, deeply occupied by foreign armies and considerably less free than she had hoped it might become after so many years of struggle. She would have to flee once more the following year when Napoleon briefly escaped his first exile and returned to power for those famous 100 days, a return she never fully forgave certain old friends for quietly welcoming. Once he was gone for good, defeated a second and final time, she came home once more and kept right on hosting right up until her death in Paris in the summer of 1817, having spent the last years of her life, just as she spent nearly every year before them, surrounded by conversation she had built entirely on her own terms. Have you ever watched someone try to silence a voice only to discover that the attempt at silencing it made that same voice louder, more determined and considerably harder to ignore than it ever would have been left alone? I suspect Napoleon of all people understood that lesson better than almost anyone else in this entire story, and understood it far too late to do anything about it. He had armies, censors, spies, and an entire continent's worth of soldiers at his command, and none of it proved quite as durable in the end as one woman's stubborn insistence on keeping her table set for 30 guests every single evening. So here we are, nearly at the end of a very long night together, having crossed an entire century, 3 different countries, and enough candlelit rooms to lose count of. And I think it is worth asking honestly, before we close this story out for good, what any of it actually adds up to, and whether the particular kind of quiet, patient power these women built for themselves ever really disappeared at all, or whether it simply learned over and over again exactly how to survive being told it was not allowed to exist. I think the honest answer is that it never really disappeared at all. It just kept finding new rooms to live inside the way water always finds a way around whatever wall someone builds to try to stop it. Think back for a moment to where we actually started tonight, a candlelit dining room on a quiet Paris street. A woman in a plain grey dress sitting near the middle of her own table, saying almost nothing, simply watching everyone else argue about Voltaire's play, while a marble version of the man himself sat silently at the centre of it all, presiding over an evening he never actually attended. At the time, it probably felt like a story about one clever hostess managing one difficult evening. It turned out to be the opening scene of something considerably larger, a whole century of women across 3 different countries, quietly discovering the exact same truth from completely different starting points, that a room built carefully enough with the right mixture of trust, wit, and hospitality could hold more real power than almost anyone watching from the outside ever gave it credit for. We have met so many of them tonight that I suspect a few names have already started blurring together in your mind, which is completely understandable this late in the evening. So let's gather them up gently one final time before we let this story rest. But before we do that, I want to circle back to the very question this whole night was built around, because I think it deserves a direct answer. rather than just a collection of names. What did these women actually talk about once the doors closed and the candles were lit? The honest answer is almost everything, and that is precisely the point. They talked about which philosopher had gotten his physics wrong, and which one had gotten it exactly right. They talked about whether a marriage arranged for money could ever really compete with a love chosen freely and quietly decided in letter after letter that it usually could not. They talked about which book deserved to be smuggled past the censors, and which gossip deserved to travel all the way to a foreign queen's breakfast table. They talked about fire and force and velocity, and whether a foreign country's poetry might have something worth admiring in it after all. They argued, laughed, flattered, wounded each other, forgave each other, and occasionally, when the subject truly could not be avoided, they talked about the government trying to control every part of their lives, carefully in code disguised as a conversation about ancient Rome. In other words, they talked about exactly the same things we still talk about tonight, just dressed in powder silk and candlelight, instead of whatever you happen to be wearing right now. There was Marie-Thérèse Geoffrin banning religion and politics from her table, not out of timidity, but because she understood that silence chosen carefully could protect people better than any argument ever could. There was Claudine de Tencin doing the exact opposite, building a room dangerous enough to let cardinals argue with atheists, because some ideas she seemed to understand only survive contact with real risk. There was Julie de Lespinasse building an entire salon out of nothing more than attention and warmth, proving that listening well might be one of the most underrated forms of intelligence history has ever refused to properly credit. There was Emily du Châtelet racing a pregnancy she suspected might kill her, so that a French reader might finally understand Newton properly, and Ninon de L'Enclos refusing marriage entirely a full century earlier, funding, without ever knowing it, the education of the very man who would later fall in love with Emily's mind. There was Louise d'Épinay writing her own version of events because she refused to let a man's unpublished grudge become the only story anyone remembered about her. There were women halfway across a continent, wearing a scrap of silk on the correct side of their face to announce an entire political loyalty without saying a single word out loud, and a physician's young wife in Berlin barred by her own country's laws from most of public life, somehow still teaching Hebrew to a future explorer between courses of dinner. There was a woman in London named for her friend's cheap wool stockings, defending Shakespeare against the most famous writer in France, and there was Madame Roland walking calmly toward a blade, addressing a plaster statue of the very ideal that was about to kill her. And there was Germaine de Stael driven out of her own country by a man who commanded armies quietly helping arrange the exact coalition that would eventually end his reign for good. Different centuries, different countries, different religions, different fortunes, different reasons for building the rooms they built. And yet somehow every single one of them arrived at almost exactly the same discovery that conversation taken, seriously treated as something worth protecting and cultivating, rather than dismissing as idle chatter, could reshape the world just as thoroughly as anything argued in a parliament, a battlefield, or a formal academy that never once thought to invite them inside. It is worth noticing, too, how much of their world quietly survived even after the rooms themselves fell apart sometimes, in ways that are almost funny once you notice them. The very word salon still lives all around us today, stretched a little thin admittedly into the place where you get your hair cut, or the annual exhibition where painters once fought for recognition, or the name printed on the front of a magazine or a website somewhere. Every time someone describes a cozy little gathering of friends discussing books or films or the news of the week as having salon energy, they are, whether they realize it or not, paying a small unconscious tribute to Catherine de Vivonne, and her blue silk walls 4 centuries after she ever thought to build them. Here is the question I keep returning to now that we've reached the end of this particular night together. How much of what we now consider modern conversation book clubs meeting in someone's living room online, communities built entirely around a shared love of ideas dinner parties, where the actual point is the talking rather than the food, quietly descends from exactly this tradition, even when nobody sitting at the table tonight has ever heard the word salon at all. I do not think that is an accident. I think it is simply what happens when an entire century of women figure out independently in 3 different languages that the seat at the head of the table was never actually the one that mattered. The real power the whole time belonged to whoever decided who got invited, who got interrupted, and who got permission to speak next. And maybe that is worth sitting with for just a moment before you drift off completely tonight. Have you ever hosted a room, even a small one, a dinner, a group chat, a quiet gathering of people who trust each other enough to speak honestly, without fully realizing you were doing something these women would have recognized instantly as their own particular kind of art? If so, you already belong in some small but real way to exactly the same lineage we have spent this entire night exploring. None of them, as far as I can tell, ever met each other. Geoffrin never sat across a table from Germaine de Staël. Ninon de l'Enclos died decades before Louise d'Épinay was even born, and yet each one seemed to inherit almost by instinct exactly the same understanding that a well-run room could quietly outlast almost anything an official institution tried to build instead. I find something deeply comforting in that particular pattern, the idea that good ideas about how to gather people, how to listen, how to make a stranger feel welcome enough to say something honest, do not actually need to be taught directly from one generation to the next. They simply get rediscovered over and over by anyone patient enough to notice what a room full of trusted people can actually accomplish together. If you have made it this far into tonight's story, and I suspect quite a few of you are already drifting somewhere between waking and sleep by now, I hope you carry at least one of these women with you into your dreams. Maybe it is Geoffrin quietly managing an entire room without raising her voice, once understanding that the loudest person in a conversation is rarely the one actually steering it. Maybe it is L'Espinasse loving people who could never quite love her back the way she needed, and building something remarkable out of that ache anyway, turning her own quiet heartbreak into one of the sharpest intellectual rooms an entire century ever produced. Maybe it is Émilie du Châtelet plunging her hands into a bowl of ice water at 3 a.m. just to finish an idea before anyone else could claim it first. Maybe it is Henrietta Hertz opening her home to princes in a city that legally considered her a lesser citizen the moment she stepped outside it. Or maybe it is Germaine de Staël packing a single trunk and slipping across a continent one step ahead of an emperor's army, rather than stay quiet, proving that persistence patiently applied over enough years can eventually outlast even a man who thought he owned half of Europe. Whichever one settles into your mind first, I think she would probably be glad to know that centuries later, in a language she never spoke, in a format she could never have imagined, someone is still listening closely enough to remember her name. Thank you sincerely for spending this entire evening here with me. Stories like this take a great deal of quiet research and even quieter care to put together properly, chasing down which detail is solidly documented and which one is simply a pretty legend repeated so many times it started sounding true. And the fact that you stayed all the way from that first candlelit dinner to this final quiet room means more than you probably realize. Nights like this one only keep happening because people like you choose to spend a small precious part of your evening here instead of somewhere else, and I do not take that choice lightly, even when you are half asleep before I finish my last sentence. If something in tonight's story moved you, made you laugh, or gave you something worth turning over in your mind while you drift off, I would love to hear about it whenever you get the chance. Maybe it was the marble bust presiding over a party its subject never attended. Maybe it was a woman funding a stranger's education out of nothing more than stubborn independence. Maybe it was simply the reminder that being underestimated for long enough sometimes leaves you with more room to maneuver than anyone watching from the outside ever expected. Whatever it was, tell me in a comment whenever you happen to wake up enough to type one out. And if you are new here, there are plenty more nights like this one waiting for you. More forgotten rooms, more overlooked women, more strange true corners of history most people never think to look for. Before I let you go completely, I want to leave you with one last small thought, because I think it fits the shape of everything we have talked about tonight better than almost anything else I could say. Every single woman in this story started out in a room where someone else had already decided what she was allowed to say, allowed to know, or allowed to become. And every single one of them found some quiet, patient, occasionally very stubborn way of expanding that room anyway, not always by shouting, not always by fighting, but often simply by choosing deliberately who to invite in and what to talk about once the door was closed. Wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, whatever room you're actually lying in right now, I hope you remember that the same quiet power belongs to you too, whenever you need it. Sleep well tonight. Rest easy wherever you are and whatever kind of day tomorrow turns out to be. Let the candles in your own imagination burn down slowly. Let the conversation in your mind grow softer and softer, and let yourself drift without any hurry at all into whatever comes next. I will be right here waiting with another story, the next time you need somewhere quiet to land another room, another century, another woman history almost let us forget. Until then, good night.